Copyright 2022, frequency 99. Rick Calhoun and the Town Full of Evil Cannibals by David Edward. Imprint, frequency 99, Ocala, Florida, USA. All rights reserved. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual events or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. Chapter 1. Idaho Springs, Colorado, 1875. I sat back and watched the crowd. No one knew me here, and I didn't recognize anyone I knew. This was a busy place, busier than what I was used to anyway. It's what I get for coming back to civilization. I wouldn't have returned but for the death of my business partner, Archibald Biggs. Most people called him Archie. I called him AB, his initials. AB was the most formidable man I had ever known, and he was brilliant. Crafty, some would say. I watched him get himself into trouble and out of it using basically the same sets of skills. But all that was over. Now I had a choice to make. AB fell out from the Wyoming Mafia, not to be confused with the Italian Mafia from back east. I knew a bunch of those boys when I used to be civilized. They were cutthroat, but you could reason with them. The Wyoming gents tended to not be so level-headed. If you didn't have red hair, dropped your B's, rolled your R's, and completely ignored half your H's, they would just as soon shoot you in the back than watch you walk away. That's how they got old AB, shot him from behind with an 8-gauge shotgun. A coward's weapon. Blew his heart clean out the front of his chest, followed pretty quickly by the rest of him. The damn thing basically turned him inside out. I wasn't there, of course. If I had been, I suspect both me and AB would be 6 feet under now, not just him. Well, not 6 feet. I only dug the hole maybe 3 feet. AB wouldn't care. It was like trying to bury a bowl of soup. I would never have even known it was him if the locals hadn't told me. Had to identify him by his hat. I hadn't bothered to look at the name of the saloon I was currently in when I walked up to it. I knew this town was Idaho Springs, which I always thought was funny, given it's in the Colorado territory, not in Idaho. Heck, Colorado was supposed to become a state next year. Just seemed confusing to call a place a name that it ain't. I was on my third shot of some brown liquid the barkeep gave me when I said the word whiskey to him. Mostly the definition of whiskey was universal, at least in my experiences. But I guess back here in civilization, I had to remember to worry about what AB used to call specifics compared to what most people deal with, which he called generalities. I was getting a slight buzz and just starting to forget about missing AB when a group of loud, red-headed men entered the saloon. They were having a good old time, a private party. The whole mood of the place changed. After several minutes of general commotion and hoopla, the group, 5 men total, started to walk to the stretch of the bar I was sitting at. As soon as they began to move, the barkeep came up to me with a real sense of urgency. "Friend," he said in a low voice. He even lowered his head a bit to make the point, which looked funny from such a big man. "You're sitting in the bossman's seat. Take your drink and move to a table." He made a minimal motion with his hand that I could see, but no one else could. "Over there. I'll send another whiskey on the house. Best way to avoid trouble for both you and me." When God closes a door, he opens a window, I thought. The barkeep had me on a tab. I didn't have any money. I was just starting to get curious about what I was going to do about the societal implications of living above my means when suddenly, the solution dropped right into my lap. "2 more whiskeys, and you clear my tab," I stated firmly, throwing back what was left of the suspicious-colored brown stuff, watching the barman's eyes dance between the approaching group of redheads and me. He didn't even debate with himself. "Fine," he said, reaching across the bar and pushing me off my stool. "Go to the table now. Go on, get." He said the last part loud enough that everyone in the place could hear him clearing the bossman's spot. When I stood up, my foot caught the edge of the bar's base, and I stumbled. It made me look a lot drunker than I was. I recovered and walked over to the little out-of-the-way table. It was actually a good spot. I sat with my back to the wall and had a view of the whole place. After the bossman sat on my stool, I watched the barkeep reach under the bar and bring up a pristine labeled bottle, not the labelless brown bottle with no stopper from which he had been serving me. I watched the bright, clear brown liquid pour out into a small, clean glass. Bigger than a shot glass. I eyeballed my little glass. It was dirty, and the liquid in it only resembled whiskey by association. They were both wet. After that, all bets were off. Whatever I was drinking had me buzzed, but not drunk. Watered down content probably, which this time was a benefit. If I had been more drunk, I would have certainly confronted the barkeep and made a show of starting a fight with the red-haired cowboy wannabe bossman sitting in my spot. It would have indeed been the end of me, and I would have known it going in and not cared. But I wasn't that drunk, so I didn't get up and complain. I just watched. Over time, I realized that the barman had not brought over our agreed-upon compensation for my adherence to the aforementioned local norm of not sitting in the bossman's spot. AB would have already handled this. He would have beat up the redheads and probably already put the squeeze on the barman for a healthy skim off the nightly take. I knew the routine, and I was just as big and just as bad as AB, but I hadn't yet decided if I wanted to continue my current profession sans AB, or if this were God opening yet another window for me. I wasn't a rookie. With all these godly opened windows, there was a proverbial draft, which of course just meant more work for me to make sure the window I ended up picking went somewhere good. Eventually, 2 more tough-looking redheads came in, making an apparent quorum. The barman rousted another fella off his stool. This was a little guy who had an eye that kind of wandered around on its own. He also blinked a lot, like there were more problems with the eye than just its independent nature. Little Blinky didn't take it as well as I did. Still, the barman was in a hurry. He eventually thrust a half-filled open brown bottle into Blinky's hands and pointed him in my direction. Blinky said something that made the barman point again. Whatever was said, it moved Blinky, who turned and headed toward me. I assume he was looking at me, but it was kinda hard to tell with the renegade eye and all. Blinky stopped about a foot from the table. He was blocking my view. When he stopped, he said, "Barkeep says you get 2 pours from this bottle. Mind if I sit down?" Blinky was irritated, but not at me. He wasn't carrying. He looked like a mine worker, had the dark coal under his fingernails and on the edges of things. Would take weeks to get it all off you if you bathed most of those days. Blinky hadn't even been trying. After a few more moments of comfortable silence, I couldn't let myself pass up a chance for information. "You got a name?" He turned from watching the same show I was. "Name's Bob." He extended a hand, and I reached over and shook it. "You local?" "Ha!" Blinky Bob turned around, so I was now looking at the back of his head. "That ha yes or ha no?" It wasn't even that I was annoyed. It was just that there were some social norms that set certain tones and required specific posturing. More of AB's philosophy, I guess. I've been here a while, if that's what you're asking. Worked for Heavy Freight for the past 5 years. I knew Heavy Freight. It was a company with some patents around ore refinement or something. They popped up in most of the Colorado Territory boom towns and did the hard work. The initial ore extraction from the rocks. They were basically middlemen. They didn't mine the ore and didn't transport it for sale, but they did pretty much everything else in between. "Worked?" I said. Blinky Bob turned around again to look me in the eye. Well, one of his eyes did. The other was involved in some table pool game with his nose and ear. "Yeah, that's right." He was indignant for some reason. I changed the subject to what I really wanted to know. I didn't need Blinky's whole life story to ask him a few questions. "What's got these Irish so excited?" I asked. "Them are the O'Brien boys. The older-looking one in the middle is their pa." "Who?" I said, sounding studied. "What are they celebrating, someone's birthday?" "Ha!" he said again. "They've been trying to branch out on their own. Got themselves a claim up just north of Empire." "Empire?" I knew most of the names of most of the places around here, but had never heard of Empire. "Yeah," Blinky blinked a few times. He was working the bottle pretty good, but he did have manners. Whenever my little glass was near empty, he reached over and refilled it. He continued. "Empire is about 10 miles up the mountain and west some. Got a big contingency of gypsies living there. Not much of a town, not like Idaho Springs, that's for sure. They got him a couple saloons, a crappy hotel, some kind of lodge for masons or something like that. Things are just getting started, no homesteaders, nothing flat up there to homestead on." "Claim gonna yield? They think so?" he said, half turning back to indicate the full-bore party now going on at the bar. I thought for a few moments. I take it something happened? Some event that makes them think they have good fortune? Ha! He said now a third time. It might be the man's catchphrase. They are so happy because they just killed the sheriff up there in Empire. Now there is no one between them, their claim, and running the whole of the town. Something in my brain clicked. I didn't yet know what it was, but now, looking back, I realized that this was the moment I changed from path A to path B. I see that very clearly in hindsight. West and north, I asked. Yeah, take the main road west. After about 6 miles, take the right-hand fork. You have to get across Oh My God Road, then another 2 miles, and you are there. Oh My God Road? He laughed. Apparently, the joke was on me. The road in question had a steep drop-off on one side. I wasn't afraid of much, but heights had me, every time. Blinky and I talked a little longer, but he wasn't the most charismatic fella, and I quickly grew tired of his perspective on things. I thanked him for the grog and stood up to leave. When I walked out, I paid special attention to all the loud redheads. I wasn't good at a lot of things, and I sometimes forgot easy stuff. But I had an eye for sizing up a man and a memory for faces that had served me very well over the years. It was still light outside, but the sun was behind the western mountain ridge, so it would start to get dark and cool off quickly. I figured I would get a couple of miles outside of town, then get maybe 20 minutes off the trail and make camp for the night. It would be a cold camp, but the weather was still more summer-like than fall. Why was I even interested in Empire? Wasn't like an emerging boomtown was new to me. I had been in towns that was startin', grown, and dyin', and every combination in between. Fact Empire was down one sheriff wasn't that interesting either. Usually wasn't a lawman that ran things, and the heavy presence of those O'Brien boys meant there wasn't going to be much independent opportunity in Empire for a while. But I was still heading there. I didn't know why, but my mind was starting to hint at it, and I didn't like where this was heading one bit. "Hey, Shortglass, don't shoot," a voice yelled out from behind me. I knew the voice. It was Blinky. He must have sensed I had an angle and followed me. "I didn't realize we were on a familiar basis," I yelled back, then finished. Blinky? I figured if we were using observational language to identify each other, I might as well participate. "Call me Bob," he yelled back, walking up confidently now that he thought I wouldn't shoot him. Why he thought that after just identifying himself suggested he wasn't a trailman. Of course, he had never claimed to be. I nodded. "What should I call you?" he asked, falling in step beside me. "Sheriff," I smiled back. He could just see the glint of my gold tooth underneath my smile in the fading darkness. Chapter 2 Empire, Help Wanted. "You owed with Archibald Biggs?" the wrinkled old man standing on the horse's other side said. "Did," I said. I had to guess at half the words to survive his accent. "How's Archie doin'?" the man asked. AB was my only reference, so I was going to have to spin things a bit, him being dead and all. "Last I saw him, he was beside himself. Most of the man you remember landed up in Wyoming. All true if you looked at it from a particular perspective. Never toughed E'd settled down. But any friend of Archie is a friend of mine," the old man said, finally getting the strap off his saddle so he could pull the whole contraption off the horse. Horses are generally some kind of stupid, but I would swear this one was relieved to get the saddle off and that he looked at me and winked about the AB story. Like it was our little secret or something. "Well, your timin' be perfect," the man said. He wiped his hand on his pants and then extended it. I took it. I had no idea how sheriffs got hired and couldn't believe it was this easy. No wonder all of them half-wits bounced so effortlessly from town to town. "Thanks," I said when the handshake was over. The horse looked at me again and nodded again. It was a weird horse. "Funeral for the last fella 'tis this afternoon," the man said. His voice broke when he said it. He turned his back and got to work on cleaning the horse's hooves. He was trying to hide the fact he was choked up. "I just put the badge in the top drawer of the desk in the office. You should wear it to the service so people can see that we know what we're doing here in Empire." "Got a tailor in town?" I asked. The man looked up. "Just in what you see." "All I see are a few saloons, a sundries store, this livery stable, and maybe 15 nondescript shanty-like buildings. There are a few decent-looking houses up the trails. The hotel looks adequate, Plus, of course, that big fancy building way over there at the end of the main street. That's the church. I looked from the man to the building and squinted to try and see it better. Don't look like no church. Looks like one of them European buildings, all that marble and the big pillars and flat roofline. The man stood up and walked over to my side of the big animal he was tending to. He stood next to me and looked at the building just like I was. When he got close, I could see his eyes were red from sadness. "We wanted something that stood out," he said. "Well, you achieved it. It's hard to miss. Ain't like nothing I've seen this side of the Mississippi." We stood there in silence for a couple of minutes, looking at the building in apparent agreement that it was hard to miss. Just when I thought maybe the old fella had fallen asleep or forgotten what we were talking about, he surprised me. "You do need some better attire if you're gonna sheriff round here," he said, switching his gaze from the building to looking me up and down. "I got's a daughter owes Andy with the needle and thread. We're civilized folk." I hated that word. Civilized. He continued. "You get over to the sheriff's office and get settled in. I'll round her up and send her over. The Chinese laundry always has extra clothes left there by people that didn't want to wait or who something happened to and are never coming back. She can find a pressed shirt and vest there and make some alterations so they fit you well and you look presentable." I must have been getting used to his accent because the whole little speech about his daughter was nearly comprehensible. We shook hands again, and I turned and left. I picked up my travel bag on the way out. It was early morning. I could feel the sun's warmth starting to chase away the cool mountain air. I turned west and headed the 50 yards to the sheriff's building. It wasn't hard to figure out which one it was. It had the word sheriff painted in big orange letters on the awning above the only door. I was pretty sure sheriff only had one R, not two. I had to be careful not to think about it too much for fear of getting stuck and losing my focus. Blinky Bob's crazy eye was having an energetic morning. I think I was starting to understand that the renegade eye was his tell. The more it bounded around trying to escape the confines set on it by the man's nose and ear, the more confused Blinky was about whatever topic had his focus. "Just like that?" Blinky Bob had just asked. He was standing in front of my new sheriff desk. Well, the desk wasn't new, very much the opposite. But I was new, so I counted it all the same. "Man's the mayor. Mayor picks the sheriff. It's in the town's bylaws," I said, proud of myself for remembering the basic setup of society out here. AB had talked about it dozens and dozens of times, maybe hundreds, while we sat around the campfire at night or when he got particularly lit at a saloon, and there wasn't much else going on. AB had never cracked the code, not like I just did. I don't think it ever occurred to him to stand behind the badge instead of in front of it. With my answer, Blinky's eye continued its voyage of random bounding. Don't he got to have the townspeople vote on it, or the town council or whatnot? Not here in Empire. See, like I said, it depends upon what the town bylaws say. I heard of laws. What's a bylaw? It was still morning. I had accomplished more today compared to most days, and it was still early. I got my first paying job since I left Philadelphia, got my first gig as a sheriff, and first employment on this side of the law. And most importantly, I had a solid lead to what AB used to call a transitory environmental opportunity. When things change, fortune favors the bold. I think old AB might have been onto something. I answered Blinky Bob, who still had a look of confusion on his face. "You want the whole civics lesson?" I asked. "Civics?" I calmed myself. "You got any schoolin', Blinky?" I asked. Blinky Bob's face changed from confusion to pride. "I gots me years of the stuff, sure," he said. I took a guess. "You make grade 4? His face didn't change a bit. "Nah, don't need no 4 years of a schoolmarm slapping my knuckles. But I got far enough to know my basic letters and numbers. I know all about George Washington and the war against the damn Brits." "Brits? Oh, British. You mean the Revolutionary War?" "Yeah, all that. Know about the coward and horse thief Benedict Arnold, how Paul Revere rode with a lantern, the whole thing." They didn't get to basic governmental structures by the 2nd grade, I take it. "You making fun of me?" I could see he honestly didn't know and was trying to figure out how mad he should get. "Not in the least," I said, all friendly like. He rolled his good eye. The crazy one seemed jealous after a bit and did the role a few seconds later. It was a very odd thing to observe. "Start at the beginning," he said, as though it were that obvious. "Okay, sure. So, you know all about the federal Constitution, right?" He snorted at the obviousness of the question. "Okay, sure. Of course you do. The short of it is that the federal Constitution makes some governmental bodies sovereign." Sovereign? Like the British king. Think of sovereign as being the bossman. Everyone can't be the bossman, right? Ha! He did his trademark laugh. Of course, everyone can't be the bossman. Good. So, you know how like at Heavy Freight where you worked, you had the big boss, the fella who owned the company. Then you had like smaller bosses. They were still the boss of you, but they were only really doing what the big boss told them to do. You mean like the shift supervisors? Yeah, like the shift supervisors. See, they may make up some of their own rules, but they can only make up additional rules if they are aligned to what the big boss wants, right? Blinky crinkled up his face, trying to process the ideas. Yeah, I see it. Like when I was on the main shift, there were so many workers that we had to wait in line to start the clock, and it was all done together. But the midnight shift didn't have as many people on it. So when I worked that shift, we could just check in with the shift supervisor when we started our day. It wasn't near as formal a process. Right, I said. So the big boss is sovereign. He can make whatever rules he thinks will make him the most money. But the shift supervisors can only augment the big boss's rules to account for local situations, like which shift you are working. What's the swing shift got to do with bylaws? I ran out of energy and decided to switch tactics, reminding myself that 3 years of schooling was pretty good and that I was lucky to have had the upbringing I did. Imagine, I said, that I'm the boss man and I tell you to go get 10 men for a chain gang. I'd ask what crime qualifies, he said very quickly, getting serious. I tell you I don't care, just need them. Bylaws, Blinky said. Bylaws, I repeated. So the state says that towns can have sheriffs, but not how they pick them. The how and the basic qualifications, those are local bylaws, I finished for him. And Empire, being very local, as they say, Blinky said, finally understanding. Empire has decided that the mayor can pick the sheriff all by himself. I tapped my finger to the side of my temple a few times. That's officer thinking, mate, I said. Oh my, I'm so sorry, Elizabeth, the mayor's daughter, exclaimed. She went from kind of pasty white to bright red in about 2 seconds. I'm all for following up, ma'am, I said, myself a little flustered. No, she really hadn't wanted to send the wrong message, I guess. I'm sorry, I have to measure your inseam. I should have been more careful, that's all. Blinky was sitting in a chair at a smaller desk across from the sheriff's desk. He was doing everything he could to not bust up laughing. The mayor's daughter wasn't very much to look at. A.B. would have called her a plain Jane. Wasn't nothing wrong with her, just wasn't anything that kind of pulled you in or got you interested. If I had to guess, I would say she was in her middle 20s. Missed the marrying boat, in a word. Elizabeth returned to her work, transferring numbers from the tape measure to a piece of paper, then measuring the pants, white shirt, and vest she had brought from the laundry and that were currently draped all over my new desk. The moment passed, and I stood there longer, feeling awkward. She was looking up at me, and I was looking down at her. I think she was teasing me because her eyes got kind of big and deer-like, and the angle of our views provided other opportunities that were starting to become real options. It was another awkward moment, but I knew that she had manufactured this one. After maybe another 10 minutes, she was done. Not too many alterations, she said, reviewing the paper she had written on. I can have this done before lunch. I said thanks and stepped down. She gave me this flirtatious sideways look when she left. I just nodded. We'll be here when the clothes are ready, I called after her and watched her leave. After she left, Blinky couldn't hold his laughter in anymore. He started roaring from his belly. It was an annoying sound, like a rat drowning in a beer glass full of sand. I thought you two were going to need a room there at the end. He finally managed to say, starting a few times, but the laughter kept getting in the way. It really irritated me, but I had no idea why. I had no ties to Elizabeth, and nothing about her or the tailoring session had changed that. "I ain't looking to sleep with the mayor's daughter on my very first day," I said back to Blinky. It was a calculated response, something AB called political, meaning that Blinky could hear the words any way he wanted, but I wasn't committing to anything. "I think she has different career goals," Blinky said, laughing again at his own joke. "When the limited stock gets a refill," I said, trying to figure it all out, "I guess you have to bid for each bull as they come along." I felt kinda silly that I didn't ask the mayor his name or get it from Elizabeth. I was going to have to go with Mr. Mayor, or Sir, for a while until I picked it up. That wasn't the only thing that caused me unease, though, to be honest. I didn't really have a plan, and I certainly didn't have any motivation for my actions. I did have experience, if that was the right word for it. I had been arrested and jailed too many times to count. I thought I could figure that side of it out, and then just kind of make the rest up as I went along. Mostly, I think, my brain was trying to put me in a position to get revenge on the Irish for what they had done to AB up in Wyoming. Sure, it wasn't these particular Irish men, but I was slowly learning that I didn't care much. If I had an itch, the solution was to scratch it. I guess I felt guilty for not being there when AB bought it, and this was some ill-conceived way of trying to quell the guilt and the itch the guilt had brought with it. I was going to have to figure out what the O'Brien claim was and why they had to get rid of the last sheriff to be able to make it. Also, why had the mayor hired me so quickly? I wasn't a lunkhead. I could put some of the pieces together, and I had a mite better education under my belt than old Blinky Bob did. They called it good paper, and I had it. All earned back east when I was civilized. Virginia College. I could complete any form in ACES if I ever needed to get into a credentialed socio-political debate. The paper got me into West Point. West Point got me into the war. Then I walked away from all of it, including a permanent commission after the war as a major and probably a career helping to rebuild South Carolina or some such place. I didn't care about any of that. During the war, I learned I had a very particular itch that could only be scratched in a very particular way, as mentioned. Too many eyes on you back in the eastern cities, and too many rules for an officer after the war. I would have been all itchy with no relief. I was also having a hard time shaking the creepy feeling I got from the mayor's daughter at that moment. Looking down at her and her looking back with those big doe eyes and that mischievous grin. I had thought that she was a plain Jane with little to remember. She must know it, and she's worked up some mannerisms that do get her remembered. Now that I think about it, that whole inseam thing was probably part of the act. With that big and bold personality, there was going to be a story about why she ain't hitched. I did look, no ring. She had every alarm I had going off. Bad news. I had all this time for introspection because I was leaning back in the barberman's chair. He had placed a hot towel over my face. I had my eyes closed as he worked on trimming up my hair and shaving the scruff off my square chin. He wasn't a talker, which suited me just fine. I wasn't much of a talker either, except when I was, of course. After a few more minutes, I could feel the barberman finishing up. When he took the towel off my face, I had quite the momentary startle. Looking back at me was not the old grizzled white-haired man who had put the towel there, but instead, a very big woman seemed to have taken his place. She had a serious look about her and was studying all the work she had done. I watched her. She had an odd look. Then I realized that she looked mildly touched, just around the edges. She reached up and brushed one side of my head, studying something. Her hands were as big as mine and even more calloused. Her arms looked to have muscle under a layer of fat. She grabbed her scissors and snipped a few more hairs, then said, "You're all done, mister." Her voice was soft. It didn't match her appearance at all. "I'm going to put some shave balm on your face. It's going to sting," she said, and then did it before I could protest. She was right. It stung. The stuff smelled too perfumey for me, too. I regretted not reacting faster to stop her from its application. She spun me around. I could pretty much make myself out in the warped mirror behind her. The cut and shave looked good. I had forgotten how well I cleaned up. But while I cleaned up okay, I still didn't have any money. "Put it on my tab," I told her. She looked from me to the original barberman. He nodded and wrote something in a ledger book he kept by his chair. "There a bathhouse in town?" I asked as I got up. "Only what you see," the barberman called out. I got the impression that he didn't want me or anyone talking to the girl. The response struck me as odd, too, given it's the same phrasing the mayor used earlier in the day. What about the whores? I knew they sometimes had a hot bath as an upsell. "Oh, that kind of bath," the man said, grinning. The girl turned red and went into a back room. "Nah," I returned, watching the girl walk away. "But I got to get cleaned up for the funeral. Plus, I got some new clothes coming. Want to start them and me off at about the same level of tidiness." Sure," he said, still smiling like we were buddies now and had a secret we shared. "Well, they can take mighty good care of you. It's the smaller building, right by the hotel." I negotiated my way into the second floor of the poorly built structure the whores called home. Once they figured out I was the new sheriff, they were nothing but helpful. I got offered a lot of free services, but I declined them all. I couldn't shake the images in my head from earlier with Elizabeth, though. I also didn't want to have one of my first official acts as the new sheriff be to start taking up free services at the whorehouse. Look, I ain't no saint. Dark days weren't that far behind me, and I knew they weren't that far ahead, neither. I knew myself pretty well. And honestly, when it came to booze and getting angry, I'd been practicing my whole life to manage those feelings. I am honestly trying to turn over a new leaf. I really and truly am fully aware that I had somehow managed to get lucky and stumble into a gig. It was good luck I didn't want to waste. If I could just hold it together for a couple months or even a year, I'd be made. I could then go find a real sheriff gig that paid well and put me as the man in a prominent, prestigious place. If you don't believe me that I am truly trying, what happened next ain't going to help my case either. Trust me, it was just a minor setback. Like I said, I could do a year without overdrinking. Done it before. Being on the trail meant there were more days without a drink than there were with one. Not a choice of mine either way. But it gave me the tools to cope. I could probably do 6 months without beating someone to death because they looked at me wrong. I was hoping that the badge made that type of thing easier. Won't be me backing down. It will be me showing restraint. Exhibiting the desired characteristics, AB would have said. I had no idea how long I could resist the whores, but by God, the answer was going to be more than a single day. AB would have been proud of me. Although that image with Elizabeth was still haunting me. I saw it like it was current events every time I closed my eyes or even blinked. I got to the upper floor of the shanty and had them clear out so I could have some privacy. I knew there would be looking holes drilled here and there and whatnot, but that didn't bother me none. Girls like these saw too much to care since I wasn't a mark ring. They had a fire in the back and brought up several buckets of hot water. I took them at the door and filled the tub, which was surprisingly nice. When the tub was full, I closed the door and got undressed. I wasn't used to carrying a sidearm. They cost too much, and the bullets were expensive as hell. My weapon of choice was a big, flat, sharp hunting knife. So, I fumbled around with the belt holster and Colt 6-shooter I had taken from the office. It was a nice gun, and the handle was something else. It looked like ivory and had a horse carved into it on both sides. It was mesmerizing. The horse faced the same way, no matter how you held the gun. It took me forever to figure out that the horse faced one way on one side and the other on the opposite side. Once I solved the puzzle, I put the belt and loaded gun on a short stool and pulled it over to the tub. I got in slowly. The water was too hot, but it felt good in a way. Once I was entirely in, I slumped down and got my head under. While under, I could feel the hot water on my face and the back of my neck where the barberman had done his work. When I came up, I reached over and used the lilac soap. It smelled feminine to me, but I didn't really care. The prospect of getting clean and enjoying the hot water was at the front of my thoughts. Once I was all washed, I went under again to rinse the soap out of my hair. When I came back up, Elizabeth was standing at the foot of the tub with the tailored clothes from earlier in her arms. It would be accurate to admit that she startled me. "Elizabeth," I said for lack of anything else coming to mind. "Sheriff," she said. Her smile and big eyes from earlier were back, albeit to a lesser degree. I reckon that she was enjoying the advantage of getting the drop on me. She turned, hung the clothes on the wall, and pulled another short stool over to the other side of the tub for my handgun. "Lean forward," she said with some authority. "You got the fronts already. I'll wash your back. Might as well get the job done completely." She picked up the bar of soap and waited. "In for a penny, in for a pound," I said, tired of dissuading her advances. Having a woman who wasn't a whore rub on me with soap while I sat in a private hot bath seemed like a pretty good way to spend the rest of the morning. Things advanced, about as you would have expected. When she announced that my back was clean and I sat up straight, let's just say it was pretty clear which way the wind was blowing. She went about a practiced routine of modesty, then did some real interesting things with the soap. I told you this wasn't going to help you believe I was trying to go straight, but by God, I don't think there is a cowboy on earth who would have escaped the situation any better. After about 40 minutes of her getting more and more creative, she left. I had to admit I was relaxed after the, events of the prior 40 minutes. We covered a lot of territory. And she used up a lot of the soap. I felt pretty good, actually. Getting all washed and shaved in some new press-tailored clothes had a way of improving a man's outlook. Not to mention Elizabeth's creativity and single focus. Plus, with my newfound employment, this was probably the best I had ever felt about myself and my situation. When I was fully dressed, I unsnapped the little snap on the holster and drew the Colt. I rolled the chamber on my arm and checked the weight in my hand. "Damn it," I said out loud. I had forgotten, yet again, to ask Elizabeth her last name so I would know the name of the mayor. I holstered the gun and reapplied the little snap. I could feel the itch returning. Nuts. This was why I avoided intimacy as much as possible. I had to admit the itch wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Also had to admit this was the first time I was with a woman who weren't a whore in a handful of years. I wondered if the two were related, but didn't get far when Elizabeth came back into the room. She looked a little sheepish. "Sorry, Sheriff," she said, avoiding eye contact. "I forgot my bonnet. No self-respecting woman would be seen without it at a funeral," she said as she quickly stepped across the room to pick it up from the corner. "Elizabeth," I said. "What?" she returned with the vinegar back in her voice. "What is your last name?" "I took my husband's name, Royston. My maiden name is O'Brien." She gave me an odd smug head turn and left with her nose in the air. Oh, whoops, big mistake there concerning her availability. I wonder why she don't wear a ring. For some reason, though, this just made the itch come back harder than ever. Chapter 3. The Funeral. Blinky Bob told me there isn't much on the level in Empire. At first, I thought he was just talking about the ground and how there ain't that many flat spots. Now, though, I realized that at a minimum, he was also talking about some of Empire's residents. "You want me to go to the funeral with you?" Blinky Bob asked me. We were both back in the little sheriff's office at our respective desks. I probably needed to address the fact with Blinky Bob that he wasn't my deputy, but I didn't have the energy to do it now. I was still recovering from earlier and getting ready to jump in feet first to whatever weird goings-on were present here in this mountain town. Plus, the real drama was about to begin. The O'Brien boys I saw back in Idaho Springs were sure to show up. And now I knew I was in the middle of some family feud, as the mayor here was also an O'Brien. On top of all that, I had just managed to violate the mayor's married daughter on my first day, and that woman had real issues for sure. I had a lot going on, including heading out publicly as the sheriff of a town I knew nothing about, and in a job I had prior to this only had disdain for. On top of all of this, my little itch had turned into a big itch, and one more thing was starting to gnaw at me. Back in Idaho Springs, the barman there had served me the cheap stuff, not the good stuff. I was going to have to start to prioritize. I hope you're starting to see just how hard it is to go straight. Boy, I had forgotten it all. I'm not even a day in. Don't be surprised that this isn't my first attempt at walking the line. The other tries were spectacular failures. So far, I'm half a day into this latest try, and it's a mixed bag, I would say. Blinky was still looking at me, waiting for a response. "You man the fort here, Blinky. No sense the two of us being in the same place at the same time all day long." Shoot, that sounded more like he was my deputy. I'll deal with it later after seeing what's up with these crazy people, I thought as I started to leave. Sure, boss, he said. By the way, I found out who the prior sheriff was. Do you want to know who? How'd you pull that off? Well, while you were up there getting serviced, he didn't know what had happened, so he was just trying to turn the screw about the whores. I went to the sundries store and asked around. So, what was his name? Hold on to your boots, he said. Last name was O'Brien. Patrick was his first name. I nodded. Of course, the last fella was an O'Brien. Don't that name ring any bells? He was gloating, but I didn't know why. Sure, same as the redheads in the bar last night. The same redheads who shot the last sheriff, who was their kin. Yep. Don't that worry you? Nope. Why not? Because we don't know enough yet to be worried. Nothing has really changed. When I walked out of the saloon yesterday, I knew I could be walking into a tight situation. All these kinfolks don't make it no tighter. Don't make it looser either. Nope. I had a lot on my mind as I walked up to Boot Hill, where the funeral was. There were boot hills behind the church in most towns. Empire wasn't no different. Well, that wasn't exact. The church sure did look different from most others I'd seen. I pushed those thoughts away. As AB would have said, buildings might be different, but even money says the people in them are mostly alike. He was probably right. So, in no particular order, a flood of observations rushed in. As I cleared the side of the church building and got a view of the cemetery, the first people I saw were the mayor, Elizabeth, and some big bloke standing next to her and holding her hand. The same hand she had used earlier to, push those thoughts away too. She was standing with a big, mean-looking fella. It was funny how stuff always lined up the same. Wasn't any way around the knowledge that at some point, that giant ape of a man would get wind of his significant other's elbow grease, and he and I would have it out. He wasn't eyeing me up or anything as I came into view, so I parked this information away. If I wasn't going straight, the move would be to kill him quick and sneaky like. Get out in front of the situation. But I was going straight. Next, I noticed that the old geezer who had hired me, Mayor O'Brien, was pretty choked up. I'm going to guess he lost his son, but that ain't confirmed yet. The last time I assumed about someone, Elizabeth's marital status, my conclusion was pretty far afield. The redheads from the saloon in Idaho Springs were there, just like I thought they would be. They were standing opposite the casket, facing Mayor O'Brien, but standing a respectful distance away. They all cut quite the silhouette, standing very stoic in their cowboy gear. They all were dressed very similarly, leather pants, black shirts, and dark brown vests. They were all heeled, and they each wore black gunfighter leather gloves. It was quite the scene. The mayor, his daughter, and son-in-law standing looking all sad on one side, awash in sunlight. Opposite them on the other side of the casket were mean-looking gunfighters standing with the wind blowing in shadows cast by the clouds. The clouds put on quite the dramatic show. The only thing that would have added to the moment would have been if I had seen it in slow motion like in the picture shows. There was a scattering of other folk, townsfolk, maybe 30 people. Many looked like gypsies. That was right, Blinky mentioned a sizable gypsy population up here somewhere. Why would gypsies attend an O'Brien funeral? I ought to know that answer as the sheriff, so more work later. There were also two clean-cut looking blonde fellas hanging back. They weren't being sheepish about it, they were being observational. I tried to get a good look at them. I would swear they were wearing badges. Maybe they were deputies? They didn't look like deputies, especially not ones from Empire, given its propensity to red-haired asshats as its primary occupants. Who could they be, then? County marshals? Oh wait, they looked like Texas Rangers. That odd combination of arrogance and stupidity. I'm going to be expected to understand jurisdiction. If my memory served, a lawman carried jurisdiction in their territory, and if they were in hot pursuit of a fugitive from their territory. The Texas Rangers had changed a lot since before the war, but they were typically competent at a minimum. My territory was the town of Empire. I was the chief justice and executioner in this town. I made a note to make sure I acted the part. But we law officers were all friendly, right? We were in a big club. So, when I talk to them, I need to be the man here in Empire and be helpful to whatever their commission is. Rangers found people and brought them in, meant they were here looking for someone. Now the big question. Suppose I had any clue as to what I was doing as the sheriff. Should I walk over to the mayor first and offer condolences? Or do I tend to these two martial clowns first to see what they are doing at the prior sheriff's funeral? AB would know, but I didn't. I flipped a coin in my head and called heads. It was always heads when I imagined the flip. I turned slightly right as I was coming up through the little black gate to the gravesites proper. The turn angled me directly for Mayor O'Brien, which also meant I was heading for Elizabeth and her husband. That girl had a right arm that wouldn't quit. Nope. Push it away. I did. When I got close, I took my hat off. Mayor O'Brien, I said, then turned a little. Ma'am, sir, I said to Elizabeth and the big fella I would eventually have to kill. I shook the mayor's hand. Elizabeth offered hers in a dainty droop. I was supposed to bend down and kiss it, I think. Wasn't no way I was bending over near this lady again, and I sure as hell wasn't putting my lips anywhere near her outstretched hand. I felt a quick wave of panic about what to do. As quickly as I could recover, I simply reached out and shook her hand like I would have done any fella. Her face turned from amusement to disappointment. Sheriff, Mayor O'Brien said, this here is my son-in-law, Henrich Royston. He's the town butcher. Henrich Royston put out his hand, and I shook it. His mitts were huge. I could feel his strength in the contact. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Royston. Mrs. Royston, I said. This is the fella I was telling you about, Mayor O'Brien said, talking to Henrich. He used to ride with Archie. Archie wasn't no lawman, Henrich said. He talked slowly. At first, I thought it made him sound dumb, but I gradually realized it made him sound more like he was earnest and contemplative. No, he wasn't, Mayor O'Brien said, looking from Henrich to me. We don't need no typical lawman. We need someone creative who knows his way around a scrape. The legal part is secondary to the first part. Henrich nodded and went into a kind of a slow contemplation. We need a flexible man, sheriff, Elizabeth said, looking at me intently. Someone who can push all the buttons and really get things singing without just shooting their gun all over the place. Someone with a long, slow rhythm to their work. Christ on a cracker. No one else seemed to notice. At least she wasn't giving me the big doe eyes. Then she did, a quick face just for me when no one else was looking. Preacher man is here, Henrich observed. Thank God. I turned, and sure enough, a fella dressed as a typical preacher was walking up the same path I had just come up. He was a tall fella who looked somber, like he carried the world on his shoulders. Everyone stepped out of his way and practically bowed when he passed. Preachermen must wind them up on Sundays. They sure seemed to carry a lot of respect for the man. When I turned back around, Mayor O'Brien said, Henrich, let's you and I go tell him we want the full service. And he's going to see my other boys and want to cut things short. Before I could figure out an excuse to go with them, they had stepped off, leaving Elizabeth and me standing by ourselves. She shifted slightly to one side so that I was directly in front of her, and I obstructed everyone else's view of her. I was trying to come up with something to say. She just stared me in the eye with an inappropriate and playful look. Without warning, she reached down and put her hand on the outside of my pants. She was familiar enough with the layout, I reckoned, which she proved when she tightened her grip, somehow putting pressure on me that hurt and was stimulating in equal measure. As soon as I started to protest, she quickly removed her hand and looked over my shoulder, batting her eyes. All worked out, Pa? She said, a quick smirk in my direction. The vinegar was back. Come on, Elizabeth. He put out his hand, which she took. We should talk to the preacher about the service as a family, I heard him say as they stepped away again. I closed my eyes and focused some, pushing all my emotions away. It worked enough, and I was able to turn around. The scene was just as I had left it. I really needed to talk more with the mayor. I just couldn't believe sheriffing was this simple, a handshake and no directions otherwise. The mayor was pretty tied up with the preacher, and I honestly didn't want to risk being around Elizabeth again. She was playing with a fire that she didn't understand. But of course I did. The itch was so bad now, I knew I would have to satisfy it soon, or else not be able to function. Damn, this was not what I had wanted at all. That woman was nothing but trouble. Could she sense the darkness in me? Was she simply suicidal? Based upon earlier, maybe? I got it. They call it being sadomasochistic. She gets off through pain. In her case, it seems mostly the pain of other people. Okay, one mystery solved. Next stop, those two Texas Rangers. I walked casually. AB would have called it moseying. A direct, slow walk that got you where you needed to be, but told everyone you were on your own schedule. As I got close, one of the blonde men whispered something to the other fella. They both looked at me and then laughed some. "You happy to see us, friend? Or do you just really like funerals?" The other fella called out. They call got me mad, which solved the other problem straight away. "You two Rangers?" I called back with a wave. We were all friendly lawmen, I reminded myself. "Who would you be, friend?" The same fella said as I got close and stopped. I pointed to my sheriff badge. "Didn't the last guy just buy it yesterday?" "In all fairness, my understanding is that it was pretty early in the morning," I said. I really had no idea when Patrick O'Brien was killed yesterday. The other fella was looking at me kind of sideways. "Don't I know you from somewhere?" he said. Look, it was possible he did. I've had my share of dust-ups down in Texas. But I knew for sure that I wasn't recognizable standing here in my new clothes with my clean-cut hair and pretty shaved face. He was just trying to rattle me, see if anything shook loose. I played the game. Maybe I pretended to study him. I arrested a 2-bit sheep rustler up in Montana a couple years back. The man liked sheep a lot, if you know what I mean. You kind of remind me of him. I paused as though I had done this before. "Your pa ever spend time in Montana?" He laughed. "No, but I do like sheep." He let his laugh transition to a smile. The other fella slapped him on the back. "We're looking for a fella goes by the name of Rick Calhoun." I nodded, careful not to show the cold bolt of fear that just ran up my spine. "You got one of them wanted posters with the likeness?" I asked. "No. This is for a different type of matter," Sheepman said. "We got us a description, though. Turns out this fella ran with another fella named Archibald Biggs." "Uh-huh," I said, pretending to be thinking on it. "So this fella, he's about your height, reported to be a mite heavier than you. He's got long, greasy hair and carries a full beard. Any distinguishing marks?" I had lost about 40 pounds working my way down from Wyoming, so I felt some relief. Not only had I lost weight, but my hair was clean and short. My beard was a memory the barbermen had just solved a couple hours ago, and just so long as they don't say gold teeth, I should be fine. He's supposed to have a particular knife wound, got a scar straight across his chest, we're told. Oh, thank God. I've been hearing that story for a while now. It was a misreading of the time AB and I had to fight our way out of Little Rock a couple years ago. Botched bank robbery. AB took the knife wound from one of the bank guards, not me, but the rumor mill turned it around for some unknown reason. "Interesting," I said. "Once this service is over, why don't you two come down to my office and we can talk more?" "Sure," one of them said. Then I had a thought. I had to act like a lawman. "And next time," I said, all full of myself like I seen lawmen do too many times to count. "Next time, you two boys come to my office first. Let me know you're in town. Avoid confusion around who's carrying in town and why." They both nodded and reached up to tip their hats. "Good, okay." Several problems down and one more to go. First, I got a sadomasochistic woman who has identified me as her new play toy. She pushes my buttons and turns me on at the same time. Bad combination. I have to believe the end goal for her is getting off while her huge dimwit of a husband beats me to death. Second, the aforementioned sadomasochist has brought the itch back, and in a bad way. I'm gonna have to scratch it soon or risk an actual incident. An incident that will be made much more difficult because of problem number 3. I got 2 Texas Rangers who miraculously showed up looking for me, but they don't know I'm me. Why would they be here in Empire? How was it even possible for them to know my whereabouts? Now for the last problem. I got to talk to these O'Brien boys from the other night and see what they are all about. Now's the time to do it when we're all in public. This one will be the hardest. Those boys are mad and I'm itchy. "You boys, listen up," I took command as I walked close. They were eyeing me up like a gator, eyeing up a fat, sleepy rabbit drinking from its pond. "I know y'all are kin, so I'll let you stay. But starting directly after the funeral, Empire has a no-carry law. You'll need to check them firearms at my office when we're all done here with the service." The man in the center, the older one Blinky said was their pa, spoke for the group. First, he spit, of course. Came close to my boot but missed. How many times had I done that when talking to a no-good lawman? "I take it you're my father's new boy?" the man said. That was a weird way to phrase it, I thought. I was trying to decide which way to play it when the roughest-looking one of them spoke up. He was probably the oldest son. "He's wearing Patrick's badge," he said to the group at large. I was on comfortable ground here. "I'm wearing the sheriff's badge, son," I said, calling him son, even though I was only a couple years his senior by all appearances. "That makes it my badge unless you feel all spunky and want to see how far you get reaching for it." The man stepped forward, but the older man put his arm out to hold him back. "Now ain't the time or the place, Connor," he said, turning his head slightly, but never taking his eyes off me. This time I spit, but I didn't miss Connor's boot. I watched him become infuriated. I smiled and wiped my chin. "Word on the street, ladies," I said, "is that Patrick O'Brien, my immediate predecessor, was shot in the back by 5 inbred-looking redheads who were also his kin." A couple of the other men moved their hands down to their side arms. I did the same, slow and steady. I unclipped the little snap and let my hand rest just above the Colt pistol handle with the horse craved into it. Now, as before, I will try and keep you in the know. As I have alluded to, I wasn't a gunman. Truth is, I was a little nervous. I was going to fumble for the snap and tip them off to this fact. But I got lucky, and my movement landed true. I undid the snap in a single fluid motion. Pure chance. Nothing but luck. But it was done, and I was now established here in the moment. The older man saw the move, and I saw his face change to one of caution. Sometimes it all works out. I shouldn't have pushed them so hard, but my whole body was itchy, and I needed to kill something or someone real bad. As sometimes happened, my brain was trying to manufacture events that might not otherwise present themselves. I took a few breaths, as did the redheads. "Okay, Sheriff," the father said. "We'll be sure to stop by your office soon as all this hoopla is over. Sound like a deal?" "I look forward to it," I said. I buttoned the little strap. They all took their hands off their sidearms. Everyone relaxed just a little. We all continued to stare at each other menacingly for a bit. All of us seemed practiced. I never realized there were so many different ways to scowl. It would have made an interesting carnival competition. Step right up, folks. See the man eating chicken. Witness the bearded lady. See the dumb cowboys stare really menacingly at each other. I moseyed away. The other good thing with a mosey was that I could half turn and walk and half keep my eyes on them so as not to simply give them my back as a target. Mayor O'Brien was done talking to the preacher and things were starting up. Nothing else too interesting happened until after the service. I'll be damned if I could have told you what denomination the preacherman was. I wasn't even sure he was reading from a Bible. The passages he used sure weren't the standard fare. He didn't read about not being afraid in the valley of evil or nothing I knew. Instead, the preacher covered a lot of stuff about finding the true light and not following the path of the corrupted. It sounded like religion, for sure. I wasn't entirely sure it was godly, though. Everyone else seemed pretty happy with it. As I stood there, the itch was at the forefront of my mind. However, as time passed and I got told to find the true path, not the path of the descriptor. What's a descriptor? My thoughts started to return to the here and now. By the end of the ceremony, my focus had shifted to finding a way to talk to old man Mayor O'Brien so he could explain his side of the goings-on. Also, so he could tell me what he thought actually happened to his son Patrick. I was starting to think Blinky had it wrong about who killed the prior sheriff. As it stood, I was still in the dark. Once the service was over, I got lucky again. Mayor O'Brien seemed just as anxious to talk to me one-on-one as I was to talk to him. I had to end up standing beside and behind him at the end of the so everyone could come up and offer their condolences. I watched the group of redheads watch me for a while, but even they got tired of waiting and moseyed off out of sight back toward town proper. The 2 Texas Rangers did the same thing. Elizabeth nodded to me and winked as she and Henrik were some of the last to leave. "Let's step inside," Mayor O'Brien said once everyone was moving and out of earshot. "I keep an office in the administrative part of the church right over here." He indicated a door on this side of the large building. I nodded and followed him down the trail. I had to admit I was interested in getting a look inside the building. I suppose I could just come to Mass on Sunday, but getting the private tour was always more interesting. I watched the back of Mayor O'Brien's head as we walked. "You all Mormons?" I finally asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. Mormonism was the only thing I could figure out that made sense because they sure weren't Catholics or Protestants. Mayor O'Brien turned his head and smiled. "Original Light Baptists," he said, then turned back to watch his step down the dirt path. "Original Light?" "I ain't the preacher man," he said without turning around. His tone was different, much more vinegar, just like Elizabeth after she thinks she's pulled one over on me. "Sure, sorry, just curious," I said. He softened. "No worries, son." We had reached the door. He opened it with a key and then held it for me. The first thing I noticed was the warm air that wafted out of the dark interior. It had a nutty, unpleasant smell. Not too distracting, but definitely on its way somewhere south. I took a few steps inside and stopped. The smell was stronger, and it was seriously dark inside. I couldn't see the floor to know where my next step would take me. I felt the mayor walk past me and heard the door close behind me. There should have been more light coming in when the door was open, but it seemed even the sunlight didn't like how his place smelled. Suddenly, there was a pop. Low, warm orange light filled the room. Mayor O'Brien had lit an oil lamp. The nutty smell intensified. It was the smell of the oil in the lamp. I had been around oil lamps my whole life, but never smelled anything like this. "What kind of oil do you all use?" I asked. The thought popped into my head at about the same time I heard it come out of my mouth. I made a note to work on that. As a lawman, I can't be going around saying everything that comes into my head when I think about it. "Baphomet oil," Mayor O'Brien said. "Never heard of it. What's it made from?" "Patchouli plants. Ever heard of mint?" "Sure." Same basic thing. He sat down behind his desk and indicated the chair on the visitor's side for me. I shrugged and sat down. The herbalist lesson about the oils apparently over. "First chance you and I got to really talk," he said, reaching into the desk and producing a very long cigar. He made a gesture to the draw, basically asking me if I wanted one. Of course I did. It looked like good leaf. But I was pretty sure I was supposed to decline as the subordinate in the room, so I did with a friendly thank you wave of my hand back. He shrugged and closed the desk drawer. Then he bit the end of the cigar, leaned over to the oil lamp, and through puffing and patience, he got the cigar lit. Once all the work was done, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me while taking a few big puffs. He stared at me, and his look changed several times. He was going over something in his head and finding different angles to it. "Chewing on something?" I asked. "See," he returned, leaning forward into the dim light. "That's it right there. You cleaned up just fine. Better than I expected." "Thanks." "You also handled yourself well with my boys and those two rangers. Just getting to know everyone. And to top it all off, Elizabeth likes you. She said you looked like a man who could get the job done. Fill the void in a big way, as she put it. Is that what she's calling it now?" I thought sarcastically. Otherwise, I wasn't really following. He leaned back into the shadows. It was quite the arrangement he made here. When he leaned back, he was in darkness, and all I could see was the tip of the lit cigar. I watched it get brighter and then fade a few times, him taking his puffs. "Let me ask you a question to help make up my mind," he said from the darkness. "Sure," I said. Damn if I wasn't getting a little rattled. "Who are those two Texas Marshals looking for?" he asked. "They're Rangers, not Marshals," said some fella from Texas, I said, wanting to avoid the topic. "Fella got a name? How was this possible? Why were the Rangers looking for me? How in the world could this old geezer of a mayor in this small back-assward wannabe town have known about it?" "Mick Carson," I said, purposefully obfuscating the name. "You mean Rick Calhoun, don't you, son?" The cigar behind the desk said. "That might be it. Went by kind of fast when they mentioned it." "That name ain't familiar to you?" "I don't know anyone who goes by Mick." "No, sir," I said. The cigar didn't puff for a while. "We can come back to that," it finally said. Sure, I got a follow-up meeting with them when we're done here. The cigar went back to puffing. At the top of a pull, the end got just bright enough for me to see the edges of O'Brien's features to know he was still back there. It was odd that my brain was seeking that type of confirmation. "See, that's it right there," he said again, just like before. I stayed quiet. Call it intuition. "You also got my boys coming for a meeting at about the same time." "That right?" I said, expressing my shock. "It is," the cigar said. "Kinda like you not bringing your accent down here," I said, noticing the difference in his speech. "That's right," he said. "It is. Here is what I am trying to figure out." He paused like I was supposed to already know and tell him. Finally, the silence got awkward. "What's that, sir?" I asked. There was a grunt. "You find yourself working at odds against a couple different groups. One group looks to be law enforcement. The other, from your point of view, are outlaws. Both outnumber you. Yet you work it out as simply as a sunrise that both groups will converge on your office simultaneously." Simultaneously? I knew what it meant, but was trying to buy time to think. "At the same time," I nodded. "I think you're right, Mayor O'Brien, sir. I'm glad you pointed that out. Could have been a real lit meeting." "I'm sure it will be," he said. Well, the cigar had won. I have to tell you, the atmosphere here was putting me on edge. I hadn't spent this long in a dark room talking to a lit cigar before. Then I realized what he had said. "You ain't telling me to give your boys a break?" "Why would I? Those bastards killed my son Patrick. I thought they were your kin too," I said. "What?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Of course, they're my kin too. Killian's my son and their pa." "He the older one that's always in the middle?" "Yes, that's him. Good boy. Strong of will." "Mr. Mayor, sir," I said, trying every ounce of diplomacy I had in me, "I do not understand your relationship with your children." "You ain't my biographer, boy," he said. The voice sounded different, though, deeper. It sounded deep and evil. "I already had me one of those a long time ago," it finished. I was very confused and completely unsettled. "Mr. O'Brien," I said, collecting myself, "if you want me to have any kind of chance of being a good sheriff, I'm going to need to be brought up to speed on the goings-on here in Empire straight away." "On that, we agree." It was back to O'Brien's voice. "I think I got it figured out." "What's that?" I asked. He put the cigar down in a tray on his desk and leaned forward into the light so I could see him again. "Did you wonder why I hired you so easily?" he said. "Sure," I said. "Why?" he asked. I had most of it figured out. "You wanted the Texas boys to see we had proper law enforcement here in Empire, so they didn't feel the need to stick around and help. And you wanted your boy Killian and his clan to see that they couldn't kill their way to your claim. There was always another lawman in line, kin or no kin." O'Brien leaned back, but the darkness wasn't the same. I could still see his face even when he was reclined. This time he stayed quiet like I had earlier, so I continued. "You brought me in here to your office to pay me a day's wage and send me off. But I either impressed you or I mucked the interactions up so bad that things are a mess and you need to keep me around. You're trying to figure out which it is. Hence, you're reckoning on it now." "You're a smart one," he said, very neutral. I still couldn't read the man. "Far from it," I said with a thin smile, "but it would be fair to say I have a healthy curiosity in its absence." That seemed to settle it for him. "That you have, my good man. What would a reasonable day's wage be for you to feel compensated and for you to have enough money to leave now and be on your way?" Had he handled all this outside after the funeral, I would have been inclined to pick a number and leave. But now he had me interested. "Hold on now, Mr. Mayor, sir," I said in a very pleasant voice. "It sounds to me like you have decided to send me on my way." "I have, clearly. I just said so." "That doesn't seem right, does it? You get me all excited about a new life and being on the right side of the law. Then you just use me for show." "Called a job, boy." His voice was hard. "When I leave this," I paused legitimately, trying to find the right word. "Church, wasn't it? Place. Ain't no one out there going to know I've been fired. Your boys won't know or care. The Texas fellas, why, I would bet someone will tip them off about my name before I make the end of the main street. Ain't my concern. Also, they don't need no tipping. Everyone already knows what they need to know." And there was the line. The man just threatened me, and it sounded like he had already betrayed me. I wasn't a gun hand, but I knew how to use the thing and had no qualms about it. I slowly reached down and released the snap. It sounded like a howitzer going off in the small, quiet room. I slipped the Colt out of the holster and held it in my hand, rolling the chamber against my other arm where we could both see it. I got me this fancy new Colt Sheriff's pistol and ain't yet had the chance to use it, I said. You going to draw on me directly after my son's funeral? He sounded indignant. No, sir, I said. I ain't going to. I already drew on you. Town might need a newspaper to keep you up on current events. I tipped the front of the weapon so it pointed right at his chest. You ain't no lawman. You've been fired. You'll hang for this. He sounded confident, but I could hear just the edge of panic in his voice. Whatever he thought I was, this wasn't it. That's not right there, Mr. Mayor, sir. Everyone knows I'm the new lawman. Just had 50 people see me standing behind you. They know I'm commissioned. Seems to me the only way that changes is if you get yourself out of here with the ability to still communicate. He was going to say something else, or maybe reach for a pistol under the desk or someplace close. I'll never know because while I am many things, I ain't no one's fool. I pulled the trigger. The round hit him hard, center chest. It should have gone through his heart and ended him straight away, but instead, he sat there clutching his chest and trying to talk for a good maybe 15 minutes. He made this irritating sucking sound, more air getting into him from his new chest ventilation hole than from his mouth or nose. As he suffered there, I got tired of waiting for him to pass. The man had fortitude. I stood up and turned the oil lamp all the way up. The room was full of papers and books. I started going through things while he watched. The whole time he was trying to say something, but only making that sickly sucking noise. Oh, I had a thought and turned to make sure he was still alive. He was, his face twisted into a combination of shock and hatred directed at me. At first, the sucking sound got frantic, then it slowly faded away. Before the sucking sound completely stopped, and his eyes kind of drifted off, I put my hand on his shoulder. The air in the room turned rancid as he passed. He soiled himself right there at the end. It happens. It wasn't anything to be embarrassed about. I figured I could stand the different smells only for a couple more minutes, so I rolled O'Brien and his nice chair out of the way so I could inventory the desk. When I turned back around to face the desk, I was hit with a wave of relief. The itch was gone. My subconscious relaxed. This was the first time I felt myself since I got to Empire, albeit that was only about 8 hours ago. The first thing I started looking for was a bottle of hooch. Since yesterday, I'd noticed that I couldn't get a solid drink. I could get grog, but that was it. I'd created my own grog often. It was an old trail hand trick, mixing whiskey or bourbon with water to stretch it. That's what I had been drinking yesterday in Idaho Springs, grog. Damn sheriff should be elevated from a trail hand, I told myself. This old geezer must keep a bottle of the good stuff in this office, or whatever this room was. I searched the desk, starting in the top drawer and working my way through the 3 drawers on either side. Lots of papers, some old-looking books with oddly smooth covers, the box of cigars, a small box of mints, several pens and pencils, 2 dead blackbirds that had been taxidermied, weird thing to keep, and a bound of paper in the center top drawer rolled up with a wax seal that said claim. No hooch. It was going to be hard to read the claim in this weird orange light. Should I risk taking it with me? I knew the answer was no. I had to leave it here. The only way I blow this is if I start walking around with items that will associate me with the inside of this office. Just like the cigars. I might want them, but I couldn't have them. I pushed things around in the center top drawer some more and found a Derringer. A small one that held a single round. It was loaded. This would have been the counterattack weapon if I hadn't acted quickly. I studied it and wanted to take it, but I remembered my thoughts from just a moment ago. Instead, the oil, rags, and little brush in the drawer gave me an idea. I took out the little cleaning kit for the Derringer. Then I unsnapped my sidearm again and emptied the rest of the unspent rounds. I cleaned it well, replacing the spent round with a fresh cartridge when I put it all back together. I smelled the piece. It smelled recently cleaned, not recently fired. I put a little more of the oil on it for good measure, then reholstered the weapon and put the derringer and little cleaning kit all back where I found it. I stared at the claim document. I would have to break the seal to read it, but that couldn't be avoided. I looked at the oil lamp. It was as high as it was going to go. I picked up the claim, walked over to the lamp, leaned against the wall, cracked the seal, and started reading. It took me about 15 minutes to read the whole thing. After a while, I started to feel I was stretching my time here, so I quickly re-rolled the claim and put it back in the top drawer. I wheeled smelly old man O'Brien back in front of his desk and looked around to ensure everything was where it should be. Then I confidently walked to the door and left. I tried to lock it, but I didn't want to take the key with me, so I left it firmly closed but unlocked. Chapter 4, Mid-Afternoon. The brisk mountain air hit me in the face when I stepped out of the office door. It smelled sweet and clean. The sun was up and the day was pleasant. A nice breeze had formed from the south, blowing gently to contrast the coolness of the mountain elevation. I stood there, taking it all in and letting my eyes adjust back to the daylight. As I stood there, I looked around. There wasn't anyone to be seen, which meant to my good fortune that no one had viewed me exit the office. My feet started walking before my head came up with a plan. I was on the clock before someone noticed that old man O'Brien wasn't in his usual haunts. Haunts, well, you get it. I knew I had to keep everything on the up and up. In a couple days, when someone found him, I would still be the sheriff, and it would be up to me to frame the investigation. Will anyone remember him and me walking down to his office after the fact? Elizabeth will remember I was with him last. I'll need to have a counter for that when the time comes. I seemed to be walking back to the sheriff's office. Made sense. I've got both the O'Briens and those 2 Texas Rangers to deal with. I still felt great from quelling the itch, so I was thinking clearly. Plans weren't always complicated. I decided to stick with my original idea, to get everyone in the same place and then just see what happened. I walked the long stretch between the church building, or whatever it was, back to the main street proper. The sheriff's office was on this end of town, so it was a short walk compared to going anywhere else in town. I expected a small crowd, but there wasn't anyone there except Blinky Bob, who had fallen asleep at his desk. Some deputy. "Blinky," I said sternly as I let the door slam. Blinky Bob shot awake. He tried to stand, but instead slid out of his chair and landed on his backside with a thud. "Greased kittens there, Sheriff. What you go and do that for?" he said from the ground, looking up. "You looking to be my deputy or not?" I sounded angrier than I was. I would have been a lot more put out if the itch was still with me. Probably would have set me off and ended old Blinky here on the spot. "You want to work with me? You better get yourself organized on when's sleeping time and when ain't. Got it?" He pushed himself up and got back in his chair. "You're right, Sheriff. Sorry, won't happen again." Good for him. I don't think he meant it, but he had a choice to make, and he made the right one. "Any fellas show up looking for me?" I asked. "Nah," he said, stretching. "Been quiet. The whole town is over there in the saloon having the wake. I think it's technically called the reception, but the wake being before the burial of the body. But that didn't matter. What mattered was what I was going to do, given how interesting the claim documents had been. Should I go over to the saloon and sheriff a bit, or stay here and wait for the crowd to clear? I decided on a third option. I told Blinky he could go over to the saloon if he wanted, and it turned out he did. I stayed on the porch of the sheriff's building, observing and looking stoic, leaning on the outer wall. This way, I wasn't showing up late, which might raise questions. AB called this strategy omnipresence, kind of meaning to be around everywhere all at once, but not be anywhere specific. I watched Blinky Bob mosey across the street. At one point, he stopped in the middle of the road and pulled the underwear out of the crack of his ass. The man was a charmer. As I stood there watching the outside of the saloon, I picked up movement way down the eastern end of the street, the opposite side that the church building was on, the way into and out of Empire. I watched, and after a while, some little fuzzy dots turned into 2 men walking their horses up the trail. They had a body tied and slung over one of their horses. They sauntered, looking tired and road-weary. sauntering looked entirely different from moseying. They saw me, and one of the men waved hello. When they got closer, they angled slightly to come straight at me. I had no idea what to do, so I just stood there watching. Eventually, they got within earshot. "You the sheriff?" The lead man yelled at me, still walking closer. Without moving, I yelled back, "That's what the badge says." The lead man produced a folded-up piece of paper. I recognized it. It was a wanted poster. "We're here to collect. Bringing in Hanging Harry." I nodded. I'd heard of Hanging Harry. Smart fella ran a scam where he would find wanted men, bring them in to collect the reward, then shoot them down right as they were being hung so he could collect at the next town. Did that over and over. "Don't look like he's moving much," I said as they stopped a few feet in front of the little porch of the little building that said Sheriff. The lead man handed me the unfolded paper. It said wanted dead or alive, $50, $500. That meant that the bounty paid $50 dead and $500 alive. "I'm open to liberal interpretations," I said, "but I ain't able to sign off on anything but dead from the looks of it." The lead man turned around and punched the tied-up body. Nothing happened. He slid a camp knife off his belt and sunk it into what was probably Harry's back. Nothing happened. "Gall danged it," the man yelled, showing what he hoped came across as genuine emotions. He slapped his leg in anger. He left the camp knife sticking out of old Harry. It was an odd choice. "Well," he said. I picked up on a practiced drop in his words meant to convey futility and disappointment. "I guess we'll just take the $50 and get on with things." I said, tipping my hat up so they could see my eyes, which I made menacing. I, of course, did not have a clue on how to actually cash out a bounty. "That bounty got a number of issue on it?" I asked. I knew the generalities of how the system worked, at least on the edges. Even AB, with all his forward thinking, never got involved with the law on this level. While we never risked it, we went over it some, just in case we ever ended up on one of the wanted posters. I knew that real bounties had to be registered with the issuing state via the telegraph service. The state kept track of all the different ones by giving them a number. The paper they had didn't have a number on it. My instincts smelled something rotten. The lead man looked at the paper. I could sense him starting to worry that he had been found out, and I didn't want a confrontation when I had just had a much better idea. "Tell you what, friend," I said very cordially. "The town mayor, Mayor O'Brien, is up yonder in his office." I gestured to the big square building at the end of the road that the locals called the church. Both men followed my gaze. "His office is around back, by the cemetery. You take your bounty there and go on up to him. He's been known to pay unnumbered warrants." Then I added something to make the pot sweeter, making the deal seem more real. "He might negotiate a bit with you, to help him cover the administrative costs, issue a death certificate showing the man died after he was transferred for the higher bounty, and all that type of paperwork. But he's been known to pay." Their faces lit up, grateful to have encountered a kindred spirit, or so they assumed. If there was a lesson I was taking away from today so far, it was not to assume anything. I was also learning that sheriffing was exhausting. I'd only had the job for a little more than half a day, and it was nothing but trouble and interruption. I watched the two horses and men saunter up Main Street. That was a lucky turn, them two. I was grateful to them. Sure, I was going to have to kill them while trying to arrest them for the murder of our good mayor, but that would be in about an hour, so I had what was looking like a few minutes of peace. But that, apparently, wasn't how sheriffing worked. Just a few moments after I tried to settle down, the two sham bounty hunters well on their way, wouldn't you know that there would be a ruckus spill out from the saloon. Suddenly, there was a cheer from the saloon, and one of the whores came stumbling out of the front swinging doors. Her dress was ripped open, and she was flapping all about. Blood was on her head and running at a good clip out of her ears. She did not look right at all as she stumbled. Her hands would seize up and form funny angles from her arms. I watched, but nothing else happened. Typically, the perpetrator would stumble out after her, yelling something about how she bit him or owed him more work or some such. Or she would be running to the sheriff, claiming this man had exceeded his time, or that fella had not paid for what he wanted, or some such. Had it happened to me more often than you would think, it seemed to be part of their business strategy. But not in this case, of course. Nothing on my first day was easy or familiar. I watched the half-clothed whore stumble all around the street, curse the sky, turn in a circle, then collapse into the dirt in the middle of the road. A pool of blood quickly formed under her head. Still, nothing else happened. Damn, I thought to myself. I couldn't leave a half-naked whore lying bloody dead in the middle of the street. I pushed myself from leaning to standing, took the 3 little steps down from the porch to the dirt road, and walked over to the body. I'd seen head wounds before, and she had a bad one. Weren't no coming back from it. She was kind of gurgling up a white bubble foam. Wasn't but a minute or 2 left. Most of her blood was now out her ear and in the dirt. I crouched down and put my hand on her shoulder. Her mouth kept making a ma, ma motion, but that was it. When she said ma, it caused some of the white bubbles to pop, then run down her chin like spittle. I had my hand on her when she passed, and I got a jolt right at the end when she transitioned. Very odd feeling. I stayed there by her for a few more moments when Elizabeth walked out, all by herself from the saloon. She walked over to me and stopped a little too close. I realized she had reversed our positions from the tailoring session earlier in the day. You see what happened in there? I asked as much for my own curiosity as for my sheriffing duties. Sure. She smiled a big friendly smile down at me and pushed her hips out more in my direction. I got it, and she was drunk. Want to provide me with a report? Her smile held. I had to whack her, she said. She seemed really happy about it. Another chill ran up my spine. This was happening a lot today. I realized that Elizabeth had the itch too. She wasn't drunk. She was basking in the afterglow of the kill. I knew that look anywhere. You did this? I heard myself say. There I went again, saying what came into my mind. I redoubled my efforts to avoid that. While I did the work, it's technically your fault, she said. How is this my fault? This woman here watched us up during your bath. She thought she could generate a revenue opportunity by getting me to pay her, not to tell my husband. I looked back down at the expired woman on the ground. Wasn't very bright, I said. What did you hit her with? Her smile got bigger. Barkeep has a shotgun he keeps behind the counter by the good stuff. I used the butt of it, got her right square between the eyes. My brain split in 2 and processed the information down 2 different paths. It was a little confusing, but I could mostly keep up. The first path was the mention of the good stuff. I stored the information. There were several bottles of it behind the bar, wherever the shotgun was stowed under the counter. I'd been getting thirsty since last night. The second path was the one I was supposed to be sheriffing on. I didn't care about no whore getting clobbered by the mayor's daughter. No one else seemed to care much either. Heck, the whole place had let out a cheer. Elizabeth, I said, standing up. Is it important to keep up appearances? You should want to more than me. Henrich is a good butcher if you follow. I followed. I don't mean that, I said, clarifying. I mean for you killing this whore. Do the townsfolk need to see me interview you and do some investigating, or does everyone kind of understand how crooked Empire really is? Oh, I see what you mean, she said, and calmly straightened her back. I watched. It was just the most amazing transformation. Out of nowhere, she went from the stone-cold bitch who I knew well enough to know she could touch her toes without bending her knees to this dainty little demure flower beside herself in grief for what she had done, and the fate of the whore given their womanly kinship. I consoled her and escorted her over to the sheriff's office. Once we got inside the building, the waterworks stopped, and the old Elizabeth was back. Before she could get any ideas, I said, "You stay here. Let me go move the body from the street. We got us an undertaker here." She was looking at her fingernails out of boredom. "Sure, creepy old man Wilcott. He's on this side of the street about 6 buildings down." She gestured east down the street. "But he's enjoying the party in the saloon, right?" I asked. "It's a wake for my brother, not a party," she said, and was serious about it. "I think the wake comes before the burial. What you got over there is a reception, not a wake." I didn't know why that distinction was important to me, but it was starting to seem like it was. "I supposed to care what you call it?" I nodded. "I guess not. What's the undertaker look like?" I said to change the subject. She laughed her vinegar laugh. "Trust me, you'll recognize him." I exhaled in defeat and turned to leave. I was getting tired of sheriffing, and I was only 2/3 of the way through my first day. I had no idea how much time it took and how there was always someone or something that required your focus. Of course, I wasn't making it any easier. I'd picked up a mistress, or was I the mistress, and had managed to murder the mayor, who was also my sole employer. I had 2 slowpoke grifters lined up and ready to take the fall, but that was an evolving situation. I had 2 Texas Rangers skulking about, waiting for something, but I didn't know what. Maybe to arrest me, or, I suppose, be told to go on their way, although that would have to come from the dead mayor, so I didn't know how I would pull that off. I had a whole clan of red-headed killers waiting to take me on. Just wait until they find out the old man is dead. And now, I got me a dead whore, killed in broad daylight with 50 witnesses by my mistress, whose giant ape of a husband will want to take me apart piece by piece should the wind blow the wrong way. Did I forget anything? I did. The claim. That presented a real opportunity. What an oddly worded legal document. I guess it never occurred to Old Man O'Brien that anyone other than his son Patrick would be the sheriff here in Empire. Either that, or it was just an oversight. Either way, it didn't matter. The claim said what it said. What an incredible run of luck, both good and bad. I readied myself as I walked across the main street, showed good planning by someone putting the sheriff's office right across from the saloon. I didn't think it was a good idea to head over. Wasn't no strategy in the move, but I didn't have a choice. I had tactical matters that needed tending, specifically a bloody dead whore in the middle of the road. It was going to be a challenge managing the redheads. The Texas fellas should offer to help, which ain't optimal either, but it's survivable. Someone will know who the Undertaker is. My other problem was not knowing the layout and players in Empire yet. The thought also crossed my mind that something nefarious was going on. What could have happened that had the saloon cheering, right after a funeral, for one woman to hit another woman in the head so hard it killed her? What kind of town was this? When I walked in, I half expected the place to stop and get quiet and have everyone turn to look at me. Just about the complete opposite happened. I walked in and no one even turned around to give notice. The first thing I did was scan all the patrons so I could get the lay of the place. I might not know Empire, but I knew saloons. I spotted the 2 Texas Rangers sitting on the far side, observing the whole place. Currently, they were also observing a glass of grog from the bottle of grog on their table. I went over the rest of the crowd twice, looking for Killian and his boys. They weren't here. Their absence put me more on edge than their presence would have. Mostly everyone was the same faces I recognized from the funeral. On my second scan, I noticed Blinky Bob sitting next to the preacherman. They were both at the far end of the bar, and Blinky was pretty animated about something. Since no one paid me any mind, I casually walked to the bar. I went pretty far down and stopped about 4 stools from where Blinky and the preacher were having their conversation. The barman tipped his imaginary hat to me and poured a short whiskey without me asking. I watched him grab the big brown nondescript bottle of grog instead of reaching under the counter for the good stuff. While I waited and tried to eavesdrop, I took a glance down the bar. Most of the glasses were full of the same muddled, watered-down alcohol, but not every glass. Here and there, I noticed the lighter, crisp tan color of good whiskey. Probably Kentucky whiskey. I could almost taste it on my lips. As I inventoried the drinkers, I was shocked when I got to the other end of the bar where Blinky was sitting. Both he and the preacherman each had a glass of the good stuff. Something clicked. My brain started screaming at me, but I couldn't pick up on what it was trying to tell me. It was something to do with the whiskey. How had little ugly Blinky Bob managed to both get an audience with the preacher and to get served from the special stock? I leaned forward, trying to get my ear closer to Blinky so I could hear what they were talking about. I was getting parts of it, but it didn't make much sense. Blinky was saying he should get a cut because of his excellent work. A cut of what? What work? The little fella walked here with me yesterday, then spent most of this morning asleep at his desk. Before I could think of what to do next, I felt a tapping on my shoulder, so I stood up straight. I had been leaning in, as mentioned, and turned around. It was the two bounty men. My face must have shown some surprise. "Sorry, boss," one of them said, stepping back, likely reacting to my expression or mannerisms or something. "Didn't mean to startle you." He quickly put his hands open and palms up, showing he wasn't armed. My mind raced, but I couldn't figure out what was going on, so I just played it straight. "Old Mayor O'Brien, get you squared away?" I asked when I recovered. "Sure did." Sheepman smiled big, as did his buddy. In a very low voice, his buddy said, "Got the whole amount minus 25%, just like you said." "That's incredible," I said, meaning it a couple different ways. "We're heading out of town, but we wanted to stop back and say thank you and buy you a drink." Typical cowboy reciprocity and, honestly, good manners. Had I read these two incorrectly? Were they on the up and up? More importantly, what had happened at the big building? I expected these two to come running back into town yelling that the mayor's been killed. Instead, they seem to have collected $500 from a dead man as a bounty on a different dead man. That would be some powerful old-time religion, for sure. I leaned back and tipped my hat up to expose my forehead. "Good for you, fellas," I said. I got a piece of advice and a question. They got concerned looks and exchanged glances. "First, the advice," I said. "I appreciate your offer of a drink, but as a lawman, that could be considered a bribe." One of the men's faces started to turn, so I kept going reasonably. No, it's all good. I appreciate the offer. It shows good manners. The advice I was going to offer was to suggest you head on up to Nevadaville. Do you know it?" "Sure," one of them said. "Good place to drink." I said, this was good advice, worth every penny. See, here in Empire, Idaho Springs, and most of these places along the Gold Rush Trail. Let's just say rain ain't the only thing that's wet here, but there's a place in Nevadaville called Mala Comida. The place doesn't look like much from the outside, but their scales are square, and their liquor ain't wet. "Anyone we need to tell that you sent us?" Sheepman asked. He was referencing basically a referral system where I get credit for rounding up business. "No, this ain't that kind of advice," I said. "If you two are honest and on the bounce, Empire might not be the right place for relaxing. I get the feeling things here might be picking up." "What was the other thing you wanted to tell us?" I smiled. "That was it, only one piece of advice. The other was a question. I was wondering if the mayor mentioned when he might be coming back down to the reception here. Did he mention how long he might be?" Apparently, the mayor, Thip, or whoever they talked to, had not offered a timeline for when they would be down to the saloon. We talked for a few more minutes, then they left. When I turned back around, the people between Blinky and me had also left. Blinky was gone too, so when I turned, I made eye contact square with the preacherman. He smiled and slid down the several stools between us, so he was sitting right by me. "You're the new sheriff," the preacher said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," I said. "You used to ride with Archibald Biggs?" "Used to run with him. Yes, sir. We never had much money, so wasn't a lot of horse riding going on," I answered truthfully. "Job was humble too, son," he said, saying the name Job from the Bible, like Joe with a B at the end. He reached out and put his hand on my forearm. "You know that story from the Bible, right?" He smelled a rare combination of clean and dirty all at the same time. It seemed the preacher had an aura of decrepit around him that he couldn't wash off. "I heard it once or twice," I answered. My disdain for these types of conversations shone through. He tightened his grip. The man had strong hands. "Good, son, good. But I bet you think the story has a moral, right?" I knew this one. I'd gone to church for a month of Sundays when I was growing up, and several more months of Sundays when I was civilized back east. I really wanted him to take his hand off me and lean back. The quickest means to that end, I hoped, was to answer his question. Plus, it wasn't much work. This was an answer I knew. If memory serves, Job was an honest man who had a good life. He had his own business, a pretty wife, and several healthy children. He was godly, I answered. "That's the right story, yes," Preacherman said excitedly. His eyes had little twinkles in them. "Go on," he said. "So as the story goes, Satan takes an interest in him. He thinks Job only believes in God because Job had earthly possessions and good fortune. So Satan takes it all away to see what will happen." The preacher stepped in. He apparently really liked this part of the story. Right, he said. Then Job loses everything. His wife dies, his children die, and he loses his business. He lost his fortune, then he himself fell sickly. He ran his arm across his mouth like he was wiping away drool. That's what they say, I said. Preacherman seemed to get just a little frustrated or something, but he still held on to a lot of anticipation. So what's the moral? He asked again, pressing a little harder than I thought he should be. He was an old guy. He looked like he had been big and strong in his youth. He was still formidable, but he gave the impression of being past his prime. Well, I thought. The story goes on, I said. It does? He pretended to be amazed. What happens next? Well, Satan can't turn Job away from God, so he gives up. Then God blesses Job, and Job lives a humble but rewarding religious life. I finished the story. Preacherman made a shocked face. That how they teach the ending down on the plain? That's how they teach it back east, sure, I said. So what's the moral? I think the moral is to believe in God no matter what. Why? He asked. I wasn't used to a preacher asking and not telling, so I had to admit that even with everything else going on, I was a little bit interested. Why is that moral? I didn't understand the question. He smiled in a fatherly way. No, son. What about the story's ending suggests that you should believe in God no matter what? I had no idea. Got me. Because it's in the Bible? My answer seemed to catch him off guard, and he laughed out loud. You're a smart one. Do you know that's pretty much it? The moral of the story is pretty much don't blame God, blame yourself. If bad things happen, it's because you didn't believe enough. That would be a new way of looking at it from the others I've heard, I said. But think about it, Sheriff. From your very own retelling, which was accurate, when did God step in to help Job? What do you mean? Well, did he help him get a family and have good fortune? Implication seems to be that Job did all that work on his own, I said, thinking hard about it. What about when Job lost everything? Did God step in and help? No, I said. We just covered that. God waited until Satan lost interest. His grip became too tight. I had to reach over with my other hand and pull on his arm. Oh, sorry, he said, letting go, looking at his hands. I get so excited when I have a chance to talk to a new congregation member, someone who is intelligent and who I can have a real conversation with. Sure, I said, rubbing my forearm where he had gripped me. So, doesn't that strike you as odd? He said, watching me rub my arm. I didn't have a clue what he meant. Doesn't what strike me as odd? That God didn't help poor Job until the devil lost interest? Is that how you read it? I asked. Nope, son. It's what it says, not how I read it. I haven't heard other preacher men talk about it that way, I said honestly. Right. His excitement seemed genuine. But it's what the book says, implies which of the two is actually in charge and more powerful. I looked him in the eye. I knew what he was starting to outline. It was called Satanism. Really bad news. But it explained why the building they called a church looked so different. What's your name, preacher? I asked. Names have power, son. You have to be careful with names. Shouldn't just give them away. Tell you what, I'll make a trade. You tell me your name and I'll tell you mine. His eyes sparkled and his face was almost pleading. Sure, preacher, I said. Why don't you go first? Stan. My name is Stan. See, not so scary. Stan I, Slaw, good American name. He looked at me expectantly. You can call me Sheriff, I said with a thin smile. Sheriff, he said like he was trying out the word. His face showed anger, and the sparkle in his eye turned to fire. You think you are being clever, but really you are showing fear. Fear of the unknown and fear of honoring a deal. Do you know what we call someone who does not honor an agreement? I'd swear the place got quieter and darker. I became fixated on the man. His eyes were the brightest thing in the room, and his voice was the loudest, even though he spoke to me softly, almost fatherly, but with the edge right there underneath his words. My university education was coming up aces here. Having been civilized often proved beneficial. I knew something about the Church of Satan, not through direct experiences, but it was part of the topics we studied at university. They had a whole course on it that I took called Parapsychology and the Occult. The big name in the occult fields was Stanislaw Przybyszewski. Sure, the name was alphabet soup. He was a Polish fella who thought he could create an organization to counter the Catholic Church. My impression was that he saw the whole thing as a business and wanted to offer a competing product. In any case, Mr. Preacherman here had Americanized the fella's first name. He hadn't told me his real name, believing, I am sure, just like he said, that names held power. "You don't look Polish to me, Mr. Preacher Slaw," I said. "You would have done better telling me your first name was Cole. That's a good, strong American name." He looked at me confused. Then his expression changed as though he had figured something out. "You got yourself an education, don't you, boy?" "Sure. I'm resting on good paper. We don't get many educated types out this way." "I'm sure you do, friend," I said. The room had returned to its prior volume and luminosity. "It's just the more educated they are, the less likely they might be to show it." He nodded and leaned in again, putting his hand back on my forearm. This time, his grip was instantly tight, tighter than before. The old fellow was strong as an ox. "So now we got us a conundrum, don't we?" he said, his face very close to mine. I picked up on that same putrid undertone I had smelled from the oil in Mayor O'Brien's office. "How's that?" I said, as I recoiled some from the man. It was amazing how simply learning something about the preacher changed how I saw him. "You still want to hold on to this sheriff job now that you learned something about our little community?" he said. I noticed some of his teeth were rotten, which I had not noticed initially. Even though Preacher Slaw here was flipping the wrong side of the coin, as AB would have said, his question about being sheriff of Empire was an honest one. Did I care about what church they all went to? I certainly was used to the God-fearing kind of church folk. Then I pushed the thought away. I had murdered the mayor in the church building. The damn thing was a church of Satan. Could that be why I did it? It actually made some sense, but in my heart, I knew I would have made the same choice to end Mayor O'Brien no matter where we had been sitting. Man, don't threaten me or betray me and live to tell about it. Period. I looked around. Blinky was gone just as before. I looked for the 2 Texas Rangers. They had left as well. Wasn't anyone but myself, Mr. Preacher Coleslaw, and maybe 20 townies. Gypsy-looking townies. The weird thing happened again, where it got quiet. But this time, it wasn't a background process. Everyone had stopped talking and were instead staring at me. When I came back around and looked at the preacher again, he was grinning from ear to ear, and the fire was back just behind his eyes. This was the tipping point. I didn't want to be the sheriff of this clown show. "You're right, Mr. Preacherman, Mr. Coleslaw," I said. "You don't need me as the sheriff. I don't want to help you any more than you want me to." His smile got broader. Too broad, it started to look otherworldly. "You tendering your resignation?" That struck me as an odd thing to want to clarify, especially given there were several dozen questions between us and that particular one. My brain had been working overtime to recall what it knew about the occult. It was nice that it could work so independently. Freed me up for the important stuff. "I'll think about it," I said. "Have me a talk with the mayor, see what his thoughts are on it." The air changed. Something was going to happen. I could feel it. The preacherman and I stared at each other. I wasn't afraid of some smelly old man. However, his eyes changed. The light was now to the front of them, a fiery light. The rest of the place closed in on me. I couldn't focus on anything but his eyes. I thought I heard talking, but it all sounded muffled. I kept falling into the man's eyes. They were the entire world and the universe beyond it. Then suddenly, with a swoosh of noise, sound flooded back in on me. The room was suddenly bright, which allowed me to look away from the preacherman. A hand was on my shoulder, pulling me away towards the door. I heard a voice I recognized, but didn't know it and couldn't place it as I tried to get my head back right. It was a woman's voice, a young woman. Suddenly it was even brighter, and I realized I was outside. How much time had passed? There was a big girl in front of me. It was the barber lady. She pulled me forward. I had stopped when I recognized her. My wits were working their way back. She pulled me by the hand, and I was completely myself again by the time she closed the door to the barber shop and turned the wood sign in the front window from open to closed. "What's your name?" I asked, not wanting to repeat the same mistake I made with the mayor in not getting his name from the start. She was focused on the window, watching the street, making sure no one was coming. I just waited, not sure what else to do. I knew she had heard me. Finally, after a couple minutes when it was clear no one was following us, she turned and said, "Betty." "Betty the barber," I said back with a friendly nod. "Thank you. I think you just saved my life." "Not saved yet," she said. She wasn't much of a talker, which I appreciated. "You see something?" She looked back to the window and then back to me. "You won't see them, but they are still coming for you." "Who? The Killian boys?" She thought for a moment. "No," she said with great introspection. "No, they are the good guys." God, I hated this town. "But they killed the last sheriff, right?" I heard myself say. Her head tilted to the side like she had just heard a high-pitched noise or something. "Yes," she answered after her head twitched a couple times. "So, how does that make them the good guys?" She nodded and went through her thinking routine. "I guess I meant good for around these parts," she said very sincerely. Chapter 5, Early Evening. I was back in the sheriff's office. Betty and I had stayed in the barber shop for maybe an hour. Her father, the barber, had left town. Something was going to happen, but she didn't know what. She was leaving now to meet up with her old man. I couldn't stay there forever. I kept going over the conversation with the preacherman. My brain was sending me warning signals not to let them claim I quit. It felt like that's what they wanted, and the other side of that statement might not go very well for me, given what happened in the saloon. I did want out. I had zero interest in living in a town full of Satan worshippers, not to mention all the other problems that had arisen. If this was my first day, just imagine once things got rolling. Elizabeth was still here in the office. In classic Elizabeth fashion, she was sleeping off the buzz in one of the bunks in the little cell near the back. Blinky was nowhere to be found, and no one else had stopped by. I studied the situation and decided this was a chance to manage one of the wild card variables. Betty had been earnest about the dangers for me if I stayed here. Very quietly, I walked over to the cell door and pulled it closed, letting the latch slip over the bolt to lock it. The sound of the bolt sliding was louder than I wanted, so I froze after the door closed and watched Elizabeth. She didn't budge, out cold from too much drink and excitement. I opened the little ammo locker where I had gotten the Colt I was carrying. There were a couple old rifles. I grabbed one with a small repeater magazine attached. I released the magazine to check the load, then reseated it. 5 rounds. I looked everywhere, but there was no second magazine, and I could not find the longer rifle cartridges anywhere. How long had this thing been loaded and just sitting here? Were the rounds still viable? I brought the chamber of the rifle up to my nose. I smelled a hint of cleaning oil. Everything looked good, with no rust. I decided to risk it as my primary weapon. I still had the Colt, but was much more comfortable with a rifle. If only I could find a good knife, I would be a real menace to society. Once I had everything I needed, I closed the little ammo station. I heard Elizabeth turn over, and she mumbled something. Not wanting to risk getting tied up with her, I quietly stepped to the door and outside. I thought I heard her voice when the door closed, but I wasn't sure and was even less interested. I rested the rifle against the outside wall and assumed my leaning spot. I had seen sheriffs do this in dozens of towns. I never knew why, but now it was making sense. I was out of the way and could observe the town's rhythm and all the comings and goings. Standing here was a solid strategy. I went over my options. I knew I should just walk away. It was so obviously the only smart move. For some reason, though, I never found myself pushing away from the wall and walking out of town. Now was the time. No one was around. It would be easy. I started to get that feeling on the back of my neck that I was being watched. It began as a little twinge and quickly turned into full-born paranoia. My brain was working overtime trying to figure out the several different problems I was up against. I let it do its work. I wasn't going anywhere, even though I didn't know why. One thing that kept bubbling up to the top was the conversation I overheard between Blinky and Preacherman Coleslaw. I knew the preacher's name wasn't Coleslaw, but that's how I thought of him. Better to bastardize his name than use the one he provided. Too many dark, unknown layers open to him to trick me. Blinky had told the preacher that he wanted a cut for his good work. Blinky was the one who told me about Empire and the sheriffing opportunity. Preacher Coleslaw was clearly the man in charge, even had Mayor O'Brien still been around. I figured I had me the ends of it, the top man and the little soldier. I needed the middle. I started to hear a ruckus from inside the office. Elizabeth had woken up and realized she was locked into the cell. She was yelling and had turned over one of the cots. I inventoried everything else, but I was torn between hightailing it out of there and staying to see if I had it in me to work the claim angle. That's why I hadn't left. My brain was working angles. That's not a good sign. I can't follow the righteous path if my brain is stuck obsessed with being a criminal. Oh, you need to know what the claim said. Sorry, with all the constant interruptions, I forgot to tell you. Me hanging around will make more sense once you know what it declared. The claim was for pretty much the top of the mounting peak that Empire sat at the base of. It included the mineral rights for the mounting top and all the land the town sat on down to 500 feet. That was fairly standard. Interestingly, Old Man O'Brien had been named the primary claim holder, but the secondary holder was simply listed as the Sheriff of Empire City, Incorporated. I assumed Empire City was the official name of this little slum. The sheriff wasn't named, only the position was referenced. I had never heard of that before. Since Old Man O'Brien was now dead and I was currently still the sheriff, I could see all kinds of possibilities in front of me. I also wasn't oblivious to the fact that I now had a motive to kill the man. This was hugely ironic since I had acted on instinct with no motive but my pride and anger. Now I had a whole epic motive that anyone could see in a straight line to me pulling the trigger. If I was the only law, I could manage this. But those two pesky Texas boys, if they get all the information, they'll smell something foul. Then there is O'Brien's other son, Killian, and his boys. Where did they go? What are their views on all of this? And what did happen when the two drifters cashed in their bounty? They clearly talked to someone and didn't see the dead mayor's body. I only had one accessible source of information, who was currently terrorizing the inanimate objects in the cell inside the office as I stood out here and thought. It took me a while to calm her down. Initially, she wasn't accepting anything other than me opening the cell door. As I sat at the sheriff's desk and tried to persuade her, I realized that I would never open the cell door. If left to my own devices, I would let her sit in there until she starved to death. It was an interesting revelation that somehow relaxed me. I had put a lot of the pieces together. Now I had to see if I could get her to verify my conclusions. First, I was saying for the umpteenth time. First, answer a few questions, then I'll let you out. I had finally worn her down. She slumped on the second cot and looked at me. She waved her hand to suggest, let's go, ask away. I didn't waste a beat. Which one of your pa's boys was adopted, Patrick or Killian? I asked. This was a very important piece of information. I thought I knew the answer based on what Killian had said to me at the funeral, but I didn't want to lead her to my assumption. Instead of answering, she chuckled. Oh my sheriff, you are a thinker, aren't you? Just answer so we can get on with it, I said. You want out or what? She snorted, then looked around. It had been a while since I came back in. The sun was setting. I had convinced her, I believed, that I held all the cards. How did you know one of them was adopted? She asked. She sounded like she was legitimately curious. Just tell me which one, I said. I knew not to engage in her questions. She was wicked smart, and I couldn't let her control the conversation in even the smallest way. Patrick, she said in a voice that carried a lot of weight, as though it was heavy just saying the words out loud. And the gold claim? I asked. O'Brien put Patrick's position as sheriff on the claim instead of his name because he didn't want Killian to be able to challenge Patrick. To appeal Patrick as second, given Killian was the biological heir? Pretty much, she said, not looking up to meet my gaze. How on earth did you figure all that out? Ain't my first time in a small town, I said. Then I decided I should throw her some scraps to keep her interested. When I talked to Killian at the funeral, he asked me if I was Old Man O'Brien's new boy. I kind of pieced it all together between that and some of the other weird goings-on. I wanted to stay on track. So Killian and his boys killed Patrick, I said. It all came to a head? I take it, they couldn't convince Old Man O'Brien to amend the claim. Killian knew he could kill one, but not both of them, or risk losing the claim altogether. Pa won't never have changed his mind. He loved Patrick like his own kin and was disappointed in Killian. A lot of bad blood between those two over time. Then I had a thought. There is no way you would be listed as second. She snorted and lifted the front of her dress so I could see her bloomers. Wrong type of plumbing, she said. So hiring me, or really anyone, was a strategy. He wanted a replacement who wasn't Killian in place before the funeral. I just happened to be the first volunteer he got. She studied me for a long time. You are a smart one, she finally said. You figured a lot of this out on your own. I never would have given you credit for being able to sort through everything, especially in under a day. Nope. This was a trap. She was trying to summarize when I was only halfway through. I didn't know much more, but she did. My brain had re-engaged and was trying to get my attention. Something dangerous was still in play here. Then I got wind of it. These people worship Satan. They ain't normal folk. I didn't really know what it meant to attend a church like this, but every instinct I had was telling me that something bad was going to happen. Am I meant to leave Empire? I finally asked, realizing that I most certainly did not hold all the cards. Had no idea where the question came from, but after hearing it, it was absolutely the right question to ask. She sat up and studied me even harder than she had been. Finally, she said, "No, Sheriff, you ain't meant to leave Empire. What are they waiting for? Need to get the okay from my father." I felt a wave of relief but didn't show it. What's he waiting on? I don't know. Should have happened by now. She was sitting up straight and very still, watching me so intently I could feel it. How will they come at me? I saw her eyes shift to the door behind me. I felt the movement too late. Whoever was back there hit me so hard in the head that I worried I would end up like the whore from earlier, all seized up and bloody in the middle of the street. But that was just a flash of panic. I felt the blow and watched the room turn sideways as everything went black. Chapter 6, Midnight? Yay, it felt like right around midnight. The first thing I was aware of was the throbbing pain in my head. I felt it long before anything else. Eventually, I realized I was bound to a pole and standing up straight. Then I realized I was colder than I should be, since the nights were still mild this time of year. I worked my head around and could just see out the bottom of the blindfold they had on me. Yep, they'd stripped me naked. It sounded like many people were milling around. The air had the sense of a crowd to it. Then I heard unholy sounds, chanting and some primal grunts. Then the sounds of carnal pleasure. These backwater freaks were having an orgy, with me tied naked to a pole in the middle of some sick demonic ceremony. I had never had much of a relationship with God, but I took a moment to thank him profusely for the blindfold. I'd seen these people during the day, and wasn't anything about them I would want to see at night, given the sounds I was hearing. After maybe half an hour, the sounds changed. There was some speech in what sounded like pig Latin. I could feel a warmth moving about me, probably torches, the way the light was moving around the edges of the blindfold. Then some other chants. Then there were maybe 6 or 8 hands on me. I smelled that rancid oil from earlier. They were rubbing it on me, probably ritual purification. These people were handsy too. Let's just say extra care was taken to ensure the smelly oil was everywhere. I started to feel real fear. It was one thing to pretend how brave you would be in this situation. It was another to live it. Slowly, the realization that this was it fell over me. I wish I could say it calmed me, but it didn't. I started to feel a shortness of breath. My heart thumped in my ears, and my head throbbed. Suddenly, there was a whisper. It sounded like Elizabeth. She was gripping my privates way too hard when she put her mouth on my ear. "Come on, Sheriff," she said, her voice so full of passion and mockery it was hard to recognize at first. But I did. I knew what she was trying to do, but while the wind had blown strong earlier in the day, she had to be out of her mind to think it would blow now. After a while of trying, she was gone. The chanting changed to a more guttural, rhythmic noise that sounded very tribal. I was afraid. Suddenly, I took a punch to the gut. It was so strong and violent and caught me entirely by surprise. I felt some ribs crack. It was a devastating impact that took my breath away. Then another punch, then a third, fourth, and fifth. It hurt real bad. These were blows that few could come back from. They made my pounding head explode in pain. My fear intensified as the pain grew. Suddenly, my arms were pulled backward and up over my head, and my feet left the ground. I screamed in agony and passed out. My sense was that I wasn't out, but maybe a few seconds. I came to and was still being hoisted up, awakened by a noise that I realized was myself still screaming in fear and anguish. It was nearly impossible to breathe. Between the gut punches and the angle of my arms, my chest wasn't working right. I started coming and going. I thought I felt the cold of a knife blade being pressed into me. Not a stab or cut, more like run across my stomach and privates for show, like demonstrating what would happen to get the crowd excited. As I faded away, I noticed that I had stopped paying attention to my physical pain. It was still there, but my mind was elsewhere. I reckoned they were going to do some awful things to my privates, then eventually cut my gut open to let me bleed out. They would probably take the blindfold off so I could see my entrails as they dance around with them. My fear left, and I was calm and at peace, waiting for the end. But it never happened. Instead, as I was up there, coming and going from lucidity, I heard all kinds of commotion followed by yelling and then gunfire. My impression was that some group had busted in on the ceremony and that a huge gunfight had ensued. It lasted for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, which is a very long time for a gunfight. "Sheriff, are you okay?" I heard it. It sounded like whoever was saying it had been saying it for a while. Also sounded like they was yelling underwater, but I heard it. I had a blanket over me and was on the ground. There were fires everywhere. It looked like whatever the ceremony was, the flames from it had spread during the gunfight. "There you are," the man said. It was one of the 2 blonde Texas Rangers. "What happened?" I asked out of instinct. When I heard myself speak, I sounded much more tired and beat up than I felt. The other ranger showed up out of the darkness. "He going to make it?" he asked his partner. My head hurt. I slowly realized that the ribs on my left side were bruised and broken. I could feel every breath. "You 2 got names?" I asked when I realized I didn't know. I simply had to start getting people's names when I first met them. "I'm Prosky. This fellow here is Wingate," the one I knew as Sheepman said. "You don't look Polish," I said. I tried to sit up, which started me coughing. The pain was sincere. On my father's side, he helped me up. Standing turned out to be a mistake. The weight shifting caused me to double over. It was only through sheer force of will and experience that I didn't fall back to the ground or pass out. I looked around. There were dozens of dead bodies, exclusively the gypsies I'd been seeing around everywhere. I didn't see Elizabeth or any of the Killian boys or Killian himself. I also noticed that the fire had spread to the brush around the cemetery where we were. Prosky saw me looking around. "When in doubt, shoot it out. That's basically our motto," he said with a humorless smile. "Is it just you 2? I asked. "Yep," Wingate said. I looked around some more. "I'm not seeing dead Killian crew bodies," I finally said. "Things didn't go as we had hoped," Prosky said, dusting his shirt off to accent the point. "We decided," Wingate jumped in, "to rescue you instead of chasing those boys when they ran." "Probably a mistake," I said. "Oh, it was a devastating error," Prosky said, and Wingate nodded in agreement. "But here we are. I suspect they'll call for reinforcements. Give me a gun. I'll help. We should finish this now." I meant it. "You're in no condition to be anything but a hindrance," Wingate said. "Prosky and I are out of ammo, and the whole crew of them hightailed it to the saloon. No way we can attack a well-defended fixed position without ammo and with a 3rd man who can barely stand." We all just stood there for a while, accepting the truth of it. "Church is gonna burn down if the wind changes," Prosky finally muttered. "That ain't no church," I said. Wingate turned to me, and I could see the fire reflecting in his eyes. "You know any place we can regroup? This is your neck of the woods, not ours." I did know the area well. My first thought was to go back to Idaho Springs, but soon after that thought popped up. My brain jumped in and flooded me with all kinds of problems in going back to where Blinky Bob found me. Then I thought of Nevadaville. I had just sent the 2 bounty men there earlier in the day. It really was a safe place for dangerous men. I decided to flip the coin in my head. Heads would be Nevadaville, tails Idaho Springs. Of course, it always landed on heads when I imagined a flip. Sure enough, it did this time too. Town a little north and east of here called Nevadaville. Refuge of outlaws and bandits. We're lawmen, "Not bandits," one of them said. I was looking north to the darkness, so I missed which one. "You want to disappear and buy some time to come back at these Empire creeps, right?" I asked rhetorically. "Then you'll need to start thinking more on the edges of things and not so much straight down the middle." Chapter 7. Nevadaville. I hadn't been on a horse in a long while. The two Texas men had rounded one up for me from I don't know where. A lot of firsts for me tonight, like riding a horse for the first time without pants. I still had the blanket wrapped around me for modesty. Let's just say I learned quickly not to fall out of rhythm with the horse, or things started slapping around, which caused great havoc. Nevadaville was what it always was when we got to it. The sun was just coming up. We were coming in from the west, so the first building we saw was the Mala Comida. Calling it a building was being kind. It was really a series of shanty shacks added on over time. One end of it stretched out over the edge of a hill. Whatever engineering wonderment held the building up was beyond my understanding. A man named Zorrito owned and ran the place. He was a big half-breed Mexican with long, greasy hair and was missing his two front teeth. He was a huge, loud, ugly fella, but I trusted him with my life. I had run with him and his brother Jazito for a couple months on the Colorado plains. Jazito had a dust-up with some local law enforcement down in Deerfield. He ended up getting hanged for, as even Zorrito often admitted, some very legitimate grievances. Zorrito gave us a room in the back for no charge. He had made enough off the two bounty hunters I had sent his way that he was in a generous mood. I slept for the next couple of days. Zorrito made biscuits that he sold with strawberry jam. He charged a penny, and after several meals, I was pretty sure I owed the man at least $1, if not more. No one would bring me a drink for the first good bit, probably about 2 days, but it was a little hard to tell as the room I was in did not have a window. When I could finally sit up without great discomfort, I convinced Zorrito to bring me a whiskey. Mala Comida was many things, but whatever they all were, there wasn't anyone who would confuse it with a high-end establishment. I had thought this would be my chance to talk Zorrito into bringing me a glass of the good stuff, but it wasn't a matter of my persuasion skills. There just wasn't anything but grog here, so there wasn't anything I could do to upgrade it. This was a shock. I had spent many a night transferring money from my pocket to Zorrito's in exchange for a glass of the good stuff. It turned out the damn bounty boys had drunk the whole supply. The Texas boys were being mighty nice to me too. I kept sniffing around for an ulterior motive, but I couldn't find one. I think they were just simple boys, and this was something interesting for them to do. Worked that way a lot out here in the West, unlike back east in civilization. Out here, if you could shoot straight and not panic at the first sign of trouble, you could go far. That became my summary of the two Texas Rangers. They could shoot straight, and they were slow to frighten. By the third day, I was feeling like getting out of bed. I pushed my legs over the side of the bed and put them on the floor. So far, so good. My gut was all bruised, the dark purple starting to turn to a pale green. I felt the sharp pinch of my ribs on my left side. Those Empire devil worshippers had really done a number on me. I had my long johns on. They were open in the front down to my waist. I looked at my middle and was surprised at how much more weight I had lost. I could see my ribs, and my belly was now completely flat. The effect would have been much more pronounced if I wasn't so bruised and bloodied. I tried to push myself to a standing position. My legs were no problem, but I couldn't straighten up without great pain in my gut. I tried it a few times, and the pain got worse, so I hobbled over to a nearby chair to sit down. Even with all the hassle, it felt good to be upright. I'm not sure how long I sat there, and eventually I fell asleep. The next thing I knew, the two Texas lawmen were sitting in chairs opposite me. They must have brought the chairs from the main hospitality room because they weren't there before I fell asleep. "You look terrible," Wingate said. Prosky, his partner, nodded in agreement. "Why are you boys still here?" I asked before I even thought of it. I was instantly angry at myself. I knew I couldn't keep doing that, not thinking about what I said, and instead just hearing it when everyone else did. I had thought I was making progress, but apparently a few days in the infirmary and I had regressed all the way back. Prosky nodded to Wingate. Wingate slowly turned from Prosky to me. "We told you we was looking for a Rick Calhoun," Wingate said. "Sure. You said it wasn't no bounty, though," I said. "That's right." Prosky leaned forward, taking over the conversation. "We think you are Rick Calhoun." I felt the fear run up my spine again, but my brain quickly jumped in to dispel it. These boys have had every opportunity to arrest me or to bring me back dead or alive, as the posters always say. They hadn't done that. Instead, they'd saved my life and stuck around making sure I was going to recover. "I admitted. It made me very uncomfortable, but I was picking up on some genuine urgency and interest from these two. "You used to ride with Archibald Biggs?" "Yep. Good man," I said, a flash of AB's face coming to the front of my memory and a twinge of grief. "Did you know Biggs was from Texas?" Prosky asked. "Sure." "Did you know his family owns substantial acreage in both Texas and Mexico?" "Didn't even know he had a family." "I meant his ma and pa." "Oh, sure. I mean, I always suspected he was born just like the rest of us, even though he sure seemed to have a higher calling," I said. Prosky ignored my attempt at a joke. "His parents both passed a couple years ago. They left him everything in their will." "Good for them," I said, not seeing where he was going. "But since he's dead, I'm not sure what good it will do him." "Absolutely none," Wingate said, taking over for Prosky. The room was silent after his statement. We all just looked at each other. The two of them were both looking at me expectantly, like I should know something, and they were waiting for me to say it. Finally, Wingate spoke. "Biggs had his own will," he said. I just stared at him. Finally, Prosky broke in. "Christ, Rick," he said to me. I hadn't been addressed by my real name in some time. It sounded odd to my ears. "He named you as his heir," Wingate said. "I ain't taking on the man's debt. No way," I exclaimed. I knew this scam. Wingate reached into his inner shirt pocket. I had a twinge of reaction, but if he was drawing on me, there wasn't anything I could do about it. Instead, he produced a set of official-looking folded papers. "Can you read?" he asked me. I leaned forward and extended my hand. He gave me the papers. They didn't weigh hardly anything, but they weighed enough to cause my ribs to explode in an intense fire when I took them. I sat back and opened them up. It was a standard boilerplate will document. I flipped past the front to the back, where the manifest would be. If this document was real, then sure enough, AB had left me his parents' estate. 10,000 acres split between southern Texas and northern Mexico. Plus, maybe 1,000 head of cattle. I scanned the list a couple of times, then looked back to the Texas Rangers. This is tens of thousands of dollars of cattle, not to mention the land. Prosky elbowed Wingate, who produced another single-folded piece of paper. After just a moment's pause, he handed it to me. I was more careful in extending my arm. I took the paper and read it. It was a finder's fee agreement. If these two could find me and get me back to Texas in the next 90 days, they were entitled to a third of the inheritance as the fee. After it was clear I had read the document, Wingate spoke. "Place for you to sign on the back that says we were the ones that notified you about the will." My mind was racing. On the one hand, I had no interest in being a rancher and moving back to Texas. On the other hand, I had never considered what life might be like if I could settle down in one place and I had enough money to do whatever I wanted. "This is a lot of information, fellas," I said. I was pretending to be overwhelmed to buy time. I suppose the fact that I needed time to think might mean that I wasn't pretending after all. They both stood up. "Take your time," Wingate said. "Think about it, then let us know." The two men exchanged glances, turned and left. Chapter 8. Good Options. It turned out that I had been in bed at the Mala Comida for over a week before I stood up and sat in the chair. Those two Texas Rangers definitely saved my life, bringing me here to recover. I had to take that into consideration. I studied the will and the finder's fee agreement. As far as I could tell, it was all on the up and up. I searched my soul and could not find a single thread of interest in going back to Texas. I bet even money with myself that there was a provision in the Rangers deal where they could also bring back proof of my demise as a means of collecting the fee. Probably not as much as if I agreed and signed their paper, but surely still enough to make the whole enterprise worthwhile. If I didn't want this, what was it that I did want? Elizabeth's doe eyes flashed across my memories. No, I didn't want that, even though some of me was interested in the dark path she offered. I can't lay here and claim that I was repulsed by everything I heard when I was up on the stake and blindfolded. Did I really want to go straight? If you can't beat them, join them, right? But I did want to go straight. As much as it irritated me, and as hard as I tried to push the thought away, it was the only answer that returned. With AB gone, I wanted out of this life. Then, why didn't I want to go to Texas? Seems like the obvious answer, and it's fallen right into my lap. AB knew me well. Should I really turn down his final gift to me? Was I that arrogant? Nuts. I just had the accompanying thought. What the hell was wrong with me? I realized not only did I want to go straight, but I wanted to earn my way as I did it. No shortcuts. I wanted to experience the satisfaction of having done it all by myself. Apparently, after years on the lam and after running away from civilization, I now wanted to be a Poindexter who sat under a white hat. Yep, when I thought about it, those were the only thoughts that allowed my mind to quiet and got rid of the feeling of pressure on the back of my neck. You've got to be kidding me. Okay, fine. I'm a white hat-wearing Poindexter wannabe. AB was very fatherly and left me a gift in his will. Should I avenge him? Is that what a white hat would do? Christ, it is. That means going back to Wyoming and finding the gang that backshot him. That thought caused a thrill to run up my spine, much different in feeling from when fear did it. Oh wait, I see. It's the same feeling and the same itch, but it wants to be scratched with more moral veracity. I started to work on my plan. Unfortunately, it was complicated, but I worked it all out. When I was done thinking, I put all the papers back into the leather holder and leaned back in bed. I was tired again. There was a glass of water by the bedside. My newfound worldviews had made me thirsty. I took a tiny sip from the glass. It immediately went down the wrong pipe. I spent the next half hour in a loop where I coughed because of the water, which caused great pain in my belly that caused me to constrict all my stomach muscles, which caused me to cough even worse. Practically the 4th of July from this side of it. Chapter 9, Only the One Direction. It took another week for me to be able to move about and feel my old self again. Well, not my old self, as I had officially transitioned apparently to a wannabe good guy. But I felt a lot better and was ready to execute my plan. I wanted to get going. During that time, I had 2 more fascinating conversations that I'll share. The first was with the Bounty Boys. Turned out their names were Fitch and Gregory. They all but confessed to me that they were in fact running a bounty scam. But not the kind I thought they were. Heck, maybe scam isn't even the right word. They were basically middlemen for a gang of red shirts riding between Denver and Fort Morgan on the Eastern Plain. Whenever the crew had a dust-up with an outlaw with a bounty, they would send these 2 in after the fact to collect the reward. Of course, I didn't care about any of that. I wanted to know what happened when they got to Old Man O'Brien's office in the Devil Church building. They had told me, and I was just in the process of not believing them and trying to work through their story. So, you went into his office by the cemetery? I had just asked, trying to glue their story together from all the pieces and parts I had been getting. Sure, just like you said, Fitch was saying. He was the lead man and did most of the talking for the 2. But did you actually go into the office or just wait outside? Just like we already told you, we went in and sat at his desk. He smoked a cigar and talked about missing his boy, Patrick. Then he paid us the full bounty, shook our hands, and we left. Tell me what he looked like again? I asked. He looked like an old Irish mayor who was sad after a funeral. Fitch was wearing thin, going in circles about the topic. I couldn't make heads nor tails of it. Eventually, they burned through enough of their reward to say their goodbyes and headed out, presumably back to Fort Morgan. The other interesting conversation was the one that cemented things for me. One of the nights when the place was packed full of people, an old woman very politely knocked on my door. She was dressed like a ringmaster from a circus, big top hat and puffy suit. She wore it well, all 4.5 feet of her looking surprisingly dignified in the otherwise non-dignified clothes. She told me her name was Mother Martus. Apparently, she was the elder of a clan of gypsies who lived here around Nevadaville. I gathered that she didn't think too much of the Empire ilk pretty early on. She had just come back to Nevadaville, and they were having some kind of meeting in the main area. They had a real federal judge sitting at a table apparently hearing a dispute. Once all that was over was when she had sought me out. "They have chosen a dark path," she said. "I'll say," I returned. Something about the little old woman made me feel comfortable, and for some reason, I trusted her. "I must apologize for what they did to you," she said. "If your Texas friends had not intervened, you would have suffered greatly." I could feel the weight of her words and nodded my understanding. "I need to know your intentions," she said after snorting at my silence. "My intentions?" I heard myself say. "Why, you got a daughter you can't unload or something?" I immediately regretted having said it, even though technically I heard it the same time she did. There was no forethought or malice intended. She snorted again and stared at me. "Look," I said sincerely, "I don't understand what you're asking me." She nodded. "Do you intend to seek revenge on the Empire clan?" I heard her just fine, but the thought was so foreign that I struggled to connect her question to anything I would consider. "I ain't some homicidal murderer lady," I heard myself say. This was getting really frustrating. I have got to get in front of my mouth. Had I really run so long outside of civilization that I didn't take the time to think anymore? Everything had become pure instinct. I was way too reliant on AB to serve as my moral compass. "Oh," she said casually. I could not read any emotions under her words. "Oh," I asked. "You upset? I ain't planning on murdering them all?" "I ain't upset, no," she said very introspectively. "But I was hopeful." "They your kind?" "No, ain't my kin," she said, still introspectively. "Me clearing them out would solve some problems for you?" She looked me in the eye. Her pupils were a light gray and very intense. I continued, "You think I got justification, and if I go in guns a-blazing, some of your problems might just go away, huh?" "Something like that," she said, holding eye contact and studying me very intently. "That what you recon a white hat would do?" I didn't know, but I was very open to some help in figuring out the right thing. "I don't see no white hats around this way much," she said. I thought her demeanor changed slightly under the skin, and she almost spat after saying white hat. "I'm going straight," I said. Why was I telling her this? Something about her made me trust her. I started to think I might actually be seeking her approval. Weird, given I had just met her, but something about her made me feel I had known her all my life. She spoke quickly. "That ain't the road for you. It's what I want. I think it's what I have always wanted." Sounds like an excuse for being yella and lazy. I might be a lazy SOB, but no one calls me a coward. I ain't yella. No way. I growled back. "I think you are." She got energetic like she knew she could bait me. I knew she could and that I would fall for it, but I continued. "So you think I'm yella, and the only way I can prove I'm not is to go back to that little backwater empire town and murder everyone." She shook her head in disappointment. "Let me tell you what they were going to do to you," she said. Her eyes had changed, and the room seemed to get darker, the one little oil lamp struggling against this something new. Then she told me. It took a couple minutes. When she finished, I said, "You're right, Mother Martis." I reached out and took her little wrinkled hand. The world was very different now than it had been just 2 minutes ago. "They need to not be alive no more. What you described can never be allowed to happen ever to anyone for any reason." She smiled. I leaned forward, and we embraced for a bit. Prosky and Wingate stared at me. We were outside. It was maybe 10 days or 2 weeks after we got here to Nevadaville. My gut was all healed, good as new. We used up all the time we had, and most everyone was getting the itch to get moving. Didn't really matter where. We were all trail hands, and moving on was just part of the deal. So there was no choice but to finish our negotiations. Who doesn't want 1,000 heads and 10 times that in acreage for nothing except showing up? Prosky said. "I've got to earn my own way," I said. "With AB gone, I've got to step out from his shadow. Taking his family's land seems like about the exact opposite." For the first time ever, I saw some frustration under the surface with these two. Prosky's tone got very serious. "Wingate and I have invested a lot of our time in finding you. Rode up here all the way from Dallas," Wingate added. "Fellas," I said, "I need your help. If I'm going to be the man I need to be, we need to set the scales square." "What do you mean?" Wingate said cautiously. I'll sign your paper after we avenge AB. How we gonna do that? I smiled. Gotta go back to Wyoming and kill the boys that shot AB in the back. The two looked at each other. You gotta do this so you feel like the inheritance is clean? Wingate said. Something like that, I said. So, if we come with you and we can find these men and we kill them, then you will sign the agreement? No, I said. What the hell do you mean no? Prosky stepped forward, getting very frustrated. Calm down, I put my hand up to stop his advance. Before we avenge AB in Wyoming, we have to go back to Empire and set things straight there. Set things straight? Prosky said. In Empire? Wingate smirked. He means to kill his way to a better life. Prosky looked from Wingate to me. You want us to help you murder the townsfolk in Empire, then ride up to Wyoming and murder a bunch more folks up there? World's full of wrongdoers, I said calmly. You want something from me. I just told you the price of it. How the world works, right? Bartertown. So, to be clear, Prosky said, Wingate and I help you clear out Empire, then follow you up to Wyoming to clear out a crew. If we do that, you'll sign the finder's fee agreement and return it to Texas with us. And when you collect, you'll give the land and cattle to us? I nodded. You know you've been here almost 2 weeks recovering? Wingate said, Sure. The Empire people haven't just been sitting on their hands during that time. I don't know. I let some of my own frustration show through. But if you do, please elaborate. They've put the word out for reinforcements. They are calling in anyone to help. The more ruthless and cutthroat, then the better. I went from near calm to angry, and I had no idea why. Why would they do that? Something is up with old man O'Brien. What do you mean? He's gone sickly. I've heard people seen him around, and he ain't right. They're bringing in the heads of 3 different families. It's like he knows he's dying or something, and they're trying to get them all there while there's still time. Wingate had been talking, but Prosky stepped in. See, I understand you want to do things a certain way, he said. But why get involved in all this? We're outnumbered and up against some cult stuff that none of us understand. Let's just go back to Texas, where we can all be rich. I looked at them both while I raced through my memories. Everyone thinking Old Man O'Brien was still walking around was starting to really get under my skin. When you two rode up to the campfire with me, staked in the center of it, who was all about? Was it the gypsies or the O'Briens or who? Weren't no gypsies, Wingate said. Prosky nodded his agreement. Yeah, we got to see more of them than we wanted to, that's for sure. Was all redheads and freckles, if you know what I mean. I knew what he meant, and I also didn't. Did you two see a little old lady gypsy wearing a big top hat? Just told you there weren't no gypsies there. Sorry, I said. I meant here. They both shook their heads no. Little woman comes into my room. She looks like a wrinkled old frog wearing a circus ringmaster getup. Didn't know you had a type, Wingate said. Ha ha, seriously, listen up. She said that the group down there split with the group up here, and that if I wanted to walk the good path, I would go back and take care of the situation. So I just assumed she meant they were the source of the devil stuff, I said. Not from what we saw. I stared at them for a long time, trying to figure out if things would be easier with or without these two. Finally, I shook my head. Fellas, I started. I ain't gonna sign your paper or go back to Texas with you until I do 2 things. The first is to care for Empire like the little old gypsy lady asked me to. Then, I'm riding north to Laramie. Once that's done, and only then, will I head down to Texas. Now it was their turn to just stare back at me. After a while of us staring at each other, I said, I could use the help. It was interesting. Wingate nodded yes, and Prosky nodded no. When they both saw this, I think they were as surprised as I was. Until now, talking to them was like talking to the same person, no matter which one was speaking. I got no problem with it, Wingate said, talking more to Prosky than me. You saw what they were doing. We seen worse, Prosky said. We have, and we did something about it when the time was right too. Not like this. Wingate looked at him. It seemed there was some unspoken communication between them. Finally, Prosky turned back to me and said, I'll head down to the Springs, meaning Colorado Springs, about 100 miles to the south. You two take care of business, then we can meet back up and head down to Texas. Figure it will take maybe a month, Wingate said to him. I know we only got the 3. He meant the date on the finder's contract. The two shook hands. They spoke more in low tones so I couldn't hear them, and Prosky finally walked away. Chapter 10, Empire, Help Needed. Wingate had a horse. I didn't. They had apparently sold the mare I had ridden here. It was found money from their standpoint. The day was just getting started. It was sunny with no clouds. Cool but not cold. The breeze was from the north. It had an edge to it. "We walk. It'll take all day," Wingate said, irritated. "Works for me. I don't want to get there until early evening anyway," I told him. He huffed but agreed. I watched him walk back into the livery and pay the keeper another 5 pennies, enough to board and feed the animal for a week. When he came back out, he looked indignant. "Okay, let's walk." "One hell of a plan. Walk all day, and then what? We just going to show up and start killing folks?" From his standpoint, I could see why he would be frustrated. He and Prosky were professionals. They took very few risks and were methodical about it when they did. He had accurately summed up my plan. I figure me showing back up will cause some consternating, and I'll just follow the trail of concerned citizens. We started walking. "Wingate," I said, "how long you been a lawman?" He spat and settled in for the long walk. "Going on 20 years, he looked off into the distance. "The war?" He turned his head and looked at me. I presumed to search for any signs of trouble. Texas was part of the Confederacy, Colorado, the Union. Although, in all fairness, Colorado was about evenly split between who sympathized with whom. Finally, he answered me. "Prosky and I were in West Texas. Now he studied me to gauge if I knew what this meant." I did. Parts of western Texas refused to provide troops to the Confederacy. It wasn't that they were against it exactly. Texans, it turned out, simply couldn't tolerate being told what to do by anyone, even themselves. I didn't care about any of that. I also knew that many people claimed to have been in West Texas when in fact they were not. "I was in the Carolinas," I said. He nodded. Everything about it that needed to be understood was understood between us, at least as it concerned the war. We walked for a couple hours in silence. Around midday, we stopped and sat under a tree for a couple minutes in the shade. It was an apple tree. I gathered up a few apples. They were scrawny and only half-formed, the tree not going into full bloom due to the elevation. But the apples were edible, and I ate a couple of them while we sat there. They were bitter and firm. "Rick," Wingate said to me after a while, "I ain't thrilled about riding into a town with the intent of killing everyone we meet." This was one of the fundamental problems with trying to go straight. You ended up surrounded by a bunch of wish-wash philosophers. Sure, there was any number of tough guys on this side of things. Had to be tough to deal with, the less civilized. But there were a lot more indecisive men who floated from place to place as much as they purposely did anything. I hadn't sized Wingate up as being one of them, but I found myself reevaluating my impressions. They had me stripped naked and up on a stick, ready to sodomize me and then set me on fire while I screamed, I said to the air in general, not focused on Wingate any more than I was focused on the tree. He looked at me hard. "So? You're the sheriff, right? Identify the perpetrators and arrest them for trial. That's what you do. You don't ride back into town guns blazing. Christ." He was right. I looked at him and then off into the distance, thinking. He seemed to realize I was mulling things over, so he just sat there in silence, waiting. "Yeah," I finally said. "I might have me a bit more experience on the other side of this here badge." He looked at me with some confusion. "Don't change nothing I just said," he returned with some gravity. Oh my God, these lawmen were such tedious business partners. Might not, but given the task at hand, I've got to use the skills I'm most comfortable with. He shifted positions so he could see me better. Just as he inhaled to deliver what was looking to be a Sunday church sermon, Betty the barber was standing in front of us. She was bloodied, and her eyes were a little crazed. I jumped and was stunned at her arrival and appearance. She was looking at me specifically. She just stood there waiting for me to acknowledge her. I scrambled to my feet. "Jesus, Betty, are you okay? What happened?" I reached out and put my hand on her shoulder to comfort her. Wingate also stood and watched intently. "They killed my pa," she said. Her voice broke at the end of the word pa. "Who did?" I asked. "Killian and his boys?" She stared straight ahead when she responded. "I told you he and his boys are the good guys." Then who killed your father? Wingate asked before I could. She blinked. Her eyes shifted to look at Wingate. Mayor O'Brien and the rest of them. They ain't no good. They're the bad guys. She nodded to herself when she said the last part, as though she was comfortable with how her words had been phrased. Preacherman? I asked. Yes, she said. Henrik Royston? I asked. Yes, she said. Elizabeth? I asked. She looked down at the ground. She was my friend, helped me learn how to make a dress and comb my hair. She betrayed you? Betty looked at me. Her eyes were sorrowful. We was friends. Friends don't do what she did. They don't clap when the mayor bites my dad in the neck, so he bleeds to death. What do you mean he bit him in the neck? Wingate interjected, his eyes getting wide. Betty got visibly angry at him. Clean the dirt out of your ears, mister. I ain't in much of a mood to be repeating myself about these goings-on. If you haven't noticed, I ain't like everyone else. I got to manage myself more than most others do. She then pushed her arms down to her side and closed her eyes. She made a show of breathing in and out for a bit. Mayor O'Brien, she said slowly. He looked like a vampire from that scary Lord Byron book. He didn't have no pointy teeth or nothing, but it's just what he looked like. He bit your father in the neck? Wingate reiterated, apparently needing to hear it again to believe it. I was more impressed that Betty was so well read. Clean through, she said. Blood squirted everywhere. Got his. She slowly pronounced the medical name brachiocephalic. Sure, his jugular, Wingate said when she finished getting the word out. Then what happened? She gave him the side eye again. Apparently, Betty did not like Wingate. There were a bunch of them. 2 of them were holding me down. Nothing I could do but watch. I struggled hard, but they had big fellas on me. My pa just kind of faded away. I watched the life fall out of his eyes. He tried to say something to me from across the room, but couldn't get it out before he passed. I wasn't one to feel empathy, but I felt it now. From Wingate's reaction, I would say the man had ice in his veins. How he wasn't moved was beyond my understanding. Betty continued. When I realized he was gone, I got furious. I felt it come up from my belly. It gave me the strength I wouldn't normally have. I was able to throw the 2 men holding me down off me and run away. I remembered you had mentioned Nevadaville for the bounty men. I didn't know what else to do, so I just started walking. It wouldn't have mattered if I was trying to go straight or not. It wouldn't have mattered that Betty had saved my life. Old me or new me, this was a situation I would not leave unresolved. Do you remember anything else? Wingate asked. Anything at all unusual? Betty softened on Wingate just a little. There were some people involved that I didn't recognize. They weren't from Empire, that's for sure. What did they look like? He asked her. Didn't look like nothing. Regular folk. Except for one of them. She brought her hand to her chin to help her think. Yeah, he was a big fella, tall and muscled, older man. Black hair with a lot of gray in it. Cold eyes, but a warm smile. Wingate looked away as though the information wasn't all that helpful. But I had a sense similar to when I first met the 2 Texas Rangers, and they said my name as who they were looking for. This bigger fella, I said. I was being deliberate. My mouth wasn't out in front of me this time, and a good thing. This might turn out to be an essential matter. Did he have all his teeth? She turned her head in what I realized was her way of thinking. That's a funny question, she said after another moment. His teeth were beautiful. They was pearly white and all straight. The chill up my spine got worse, not better. Mustache, that kind of sat on his upper lip like it was meant to hold back the oceans. He would wink at you when no one else could see to instill confidence. That's the fella. She looked from me to Wingate, but he was looking intently at me. There was a light in his eye that wasn't there before. I recognized it just in time. I had picked up a rusty camp knife in Nevadaville. But rust or not, I was a formidable whirlwind. In a single fluid motion, I slipped the knife out of its leather sheath behind my back. Still looking Wingate in the eye for as long as I could, I quickly drove the blade into his ribs and twisted it upward to hit his heart before he knew what was going on. This was a move I had perfected, and every bit of my skills were on display. His face changed a couple of times as he tried to process what had happened, but I also knew that since his heart had stopped, he would struggle as the blood was leaving his brain. Betty didn't seem surprised at all. She just stood there motionless and watched in near indifference. I helped to ease Wingate to the ground. I wiped my knife on his shirt when he was gone and stood back up. "That taller fella I described," she said as she watched me. She still hadn't moved, but I could sense she was on alert to ensure I wasn't going crazy and that this was the start of a murder spree. I nodded. "That's the guy you told me about? A.B.? "Sure sounds like him," I said. "You said he was dead." "I did. If this is him, he ain't so dead." "Nope." She stared at me. "It's worse than you think," I said after a while, everything slowly coming together for me. I realized Betty was going to be the only help I had. "Pa's dead." I could see resolve forming underneath her sadness. "Ain't nothing worse gonna happen than that. After the funeral, I shot the mayor dead in his church office." "That ain't no church," she said, same as I had a while ago. "And apparently, he ain't any kind of dead." "So, your friend who was dead is alive, and the mayor who's alive is really dead." I didn't have any better grasp of it than she did. We both just stood there for a while. Then she punched me hard in the gut right out of the blue. Good thing I was all fixed up. I doubled over and dropped to my knees. "Don't go stabbing folks in front of me without warning no more," she said with little emotion, but a lot of vinegar. I nodded and stood back up, both my arms wrapped around my middle. "He was in on it," I said. "You don't know that for sure," she said, "but I understand you couldn't take the chance." I saw his eyes change, Betty. Plus, it's the only real explanation to his actions. A.B. wanted me in Texas for some reason, not here in Colorado. "We keep adding layers to an already thin cake," I said. Chapter 11. This isn't going well at all. We hid Wingate's body off the trail and decided to cold camp far up the mountain where we could sleep undisturbed. The next morning, we were both up early, before the sun. Neither of us said much. We knew the plan, and we were working through whatever it was people worked through to prepare for what had to be done. For me, it was just visualizing some of the pivotal events. For Betty, I had no idea what went through her head. Betty had taken Wingate's side arm and rifle. I took his hunting knife. It was loads better in quality than the camp knife I had. I started a fire, and we cooked some rabbit for breakfast that Betty had caught overnight in a trap. While we were eating, I figured I needed to assess how good Betty would be in the fight, just like I would a fella. "You have any experience with a sidearm?" She looked at me between bites. She had grease on her fingers and her lips. She nodded to me and wiped her hands on her pants, then wiped her mouth on the back of her arm. Suddenly, quick as the rabbit she had caught, she drew and fired at the makeshift spit roaster that ran through the thing over the fire. She hit the handle just right, and the rabbit spun around 5 or 6 times. It was an amazing shot. I nodded. "Well and good, but you ever been in a firefight where you had other people shooting back?" She shook her head yes, which surprised me, but then said, "No, but I'm in grief for my pa, so it ain't going to be a problem. I should probably be wearing black." She seemed like she meant it. However, I had been around enough first-time tough guys to know that intent and execution sometimes spun off in different directions. That said, she gave me the impression that she was all in, which was really what counted. "I think black is just for widows," I said. After realizing she didn't get my joke, I reminded myself that humor wasn't her specialty. "Never knew my ma," she said, confirming my thought about her and a joke. She had not even understood my statement. She was wise in a kind of straight-line way. If you took a turn, even a gentle one, it seemed like she lost track of any nuances and ran right off the road. I shook my head. "Well, we ain't got no way to get either of us new clothes at this point, so we'll just have to make do." She nodded gravely. We were having 2 very different conversations. "You going to be okay shooting people you used to know?" I asked her. A twinge of doubt flashed through my head based on the conversation so far. I had to ask, and nuances weren't going to register. She looked at me with her mouth full. Her lips and hands were greasy again. "I'm going to revel in it," she said, then spit out a bone and went back to chewing. Her demeanor made me feel both better and worse all at the same time. We broke camp as the sun was just coming up. Given we were about halfway to Empire, unless something seriously impacted our journey, we should be showing up to town right around midday, basically right at noon. It was cooler this morning, Maybe a small weather front had come through. It felt like the temperature had dropped about 15 or 20 degrees across the board. There was little wind. The cool air made the morning feel crisp and clean. I was starting to see Betty differently, noticing more of her unique perspectives versus her odd delivery and slightly touched appearance. She sure did look focused and ready for a fight. "You'll want to try and think about other stuff until we get there," I told her when I noticed how intently her head was turning from one side to another as she thought, and we walked. "Don't worry about me. I'm focused," she said, looking far down the trail we were walking. "Pa taught me how to concentrate so I can get stuff done. That's why I was cutting your hair. It's how I learned to manage myself better." "Sure, no complaints here," I said. "But I've been through this a few times, walking to what I know will be a gunfight. First time I ever did it, I was just like you now, all focused and thinking through everything. By the time the fight started, I was already exhausted from all my mental gymnastics. Try and separate out the noisy part of your mind from the part that's enjoying the cool day and the pretty scenery. Your friend AB taught you how to keep your mind off of things?" "Sure, yes," I said. Her face changed, and I followed her thought pattern. "You think AB knows I'm coming?" She had this habit of not turning her head to look at me, but instead looking far down the trail ahead when she was answering me. "Weren't there 2 of them Texas boys?" "Yes. You stabbed one in the heart?" "You know I did. Still a current event." "You figure the other one just went home?" "Wow. It was obvious. How did I miss it?" Prosky said he was riding down to the springs where we would meet him in about a month. "Empire's on the way out of the mountains if you take the mule trail, then head north after Oh My God Road instead of taking the main road south," she said. "That would be the way to go," I said, looking between her and the horizon like she was. "Don't he pretty much know your whole plan?" "Does," I said. "Went over the thing with them both for days." She turned her head and looked at me. "You reckon maybe we should devise a new plan then?" I didn't know. AB was the planner. My job was just to do the unpleasant work he didn't want to do. "We ain't dealing in West Point tactics," I said, buying time to think. "We've got to formulate a strategy," she said, "like when I cut some fella's hair. I try to figure out his head's shape, then I know a few different cuts and what looks good on what head shape. The hairstyle becomes the strategy, then how I use the scissors is like the tactics, how I fulfill the strategy." "That how your dad did it?" "That's how he taught me, given my unique natures and all, yes," she said. "He sounds like a smart man," I said. "I miss him." Her voice broke. She sucked in air between her lips. It only lasted about a second, then she recovered. Only Betty and the Lord knew what went on in her head. She cried, but didn't let it get out of hand. We kept walking. After maybe 20 minutes of her pulling herself together, she asked me, "Was this AB fella like your pa?" "Never knew my pa," I said, pushing back my own unpleasant memories. "What about your ma?" "You don't want to hear my life story," I waved my arm dismissively. "Got no choice." She turned her head this time, which caught me off guard. "I gots me all kinds of choices," I said, a little defensive for some reason. "But I don't take your meaning. You know how I earn my living, who my pa was, and you have the details of a recent tragic event," she said, almost like she was reciting something she had been forced to memorize. "That makes us acquainted, so I gotta have some details or we're not in balance, and we can't go into a gunfight out of balance." I think the word that came to mind was eccentric. The sun was full into the sky now. Things were warming up some. I could still see my breath, but my nose and ears weren't cold from the air as we walked. My ma was a working girl. You know what I mean? I looked over at her. "Sure, your mama was a whore," she said, not understanding the implications of saying it like that. She was just stating it back as a fact, like I told her. "I wouldn't put it that way, but you ain't wrong. She wasn't a very good mother, as you can imagine, but I can report she was one hell of a whore. Yet she managed to get knocked up, and I had a little brother by the time I was 3. When we were little, she kept us in the room with her as she worked. Where else could she put us? Wasn't no one willing to look after a pair of snot-nosed tykes when there was money to be made?" I looked up to the sky, pushing away the irritation of having to go over this. I forced myself to keep going. By the time I was about 12, I figured out that the life my brother and I were living wasn't meant for children. She had started including my brother as part of her services. At first, I didn't completely understand. Still, I noticed how much more she was making, and I appreciated that we could afford a private room instead of just living on the street. But as in all things, as I got a little older, I started to understand the difference between right and wrong. This time, my voice broke, thinking back to those days. I decided that me and Gregory, my brother, we would run away. I planned it all out. I knew it would be challenging in the city for two kids, 12 and 9, but it wouldn't be as bad as where we were. We snuck out late one night, but we didn't get far. Apparently, it wasn't my May's idea to use my brother. It was her pimp's, and he wasn't about to let a moneymaker just sneak off into the night. When we got caught, he started to take it out on me. Couldn't beat my brother too bad. He damaged the goods. He was a big fella that smelled like onions. I fought back valiantly, but I was a scrawny kid and wouldn't have stood much of a chance anyway. I remember he kept hitting me in the head. He was right-handed, so he was hitting my left side. Even as a kid, I knew he was hitting me way too hard. His intention was to kill me, not just teach me a lesson. There came the point where I still kind of knew what was going on, but I didn't feel the impacts of his punches anymore. I was very close to gone when suddenly the beating stopped. I tried to look around and figure out what was happening, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. After a good while and being moved several times, I eventually came to in a nice bed with clean white sheets. I was in an infirmary. AB had apparently rescued me. He killed my mother's pimp, but not before my brother had been beaten to death. He told me that he gave my mother a choice, raise me right or leave the city. He told me she decided to leave the city and left me to be his ward. I had been talking for a while, lost in my own thoughts. I didn't allow myself to remember these times very often, so it was challenging to find the energy to repeat it all back for Betty. She was still looking straight with her focus way down the road. "We acquainted yet?" I asked her, hoping to end the pain of remembering all of this. "AB, really kill your ma instead of letting her go?" she said in the same flat way she spoke about everything when it was new to her. "Yeah," I said. "I learned that later on." "And he really ran the pimp? He was the boss of the entire neighborhood?" "Seems so," I said. I was impressed she could see through the BS so quickly and easily. "How did you know?" "I've been cutting hair a while, mister. Only so many stories out there." "So we acquainted now?" "Yep, we're good," she said. She never looked over once, just kept her focus off in the distance. "So I can now tell you the rest of it." "The rest of it?" I asked, unclear. "It's not much. I don't know why, but I know that I can't tell this last part to just anyone. I can only tell people I know that I am acquainted with. I don't know why, but I know it's important to do it that way." I watched her. "That's why we had to exchange stories, see?" "Sure," I said, not really seeing anything. "So, Empire used to be just like anywhere else. Pa and I got there maybe a year ago. We had the whole Pikes Peak rush down south, then they started finding all that ore in Gilpin County. We rode the rush in the springs, figured we could get a foothold up here as well." I nodded. "Made sense," she continued. "So one day, the mayor decides to have a fair like a circus or some such. I don't know where he got the idea from. It was fun though. Lots of planning and lots of new people needing to be groomed up. A whole lot of people showed up from all over. I think they called them vendors. Never heard of such before, traveling around instead of picking a spot like Pa and I did. In any case, this one fella showed up. He was a very odd duck. I keep thinking back, and for the life of me, I can't remember what his face looked like. I know I saw it and remember talking to him, but I don't remember what we talked about. It's like I can remember remembering, but not the actual events. "That is odd," I said. It felt like I needed to interject every now and then to keep her going. My pa didn't like him. I did, but I trusted my pa's instincts over mine. Pa called him a snake oil salesman. I remember thinking that was funny. I must have mentioned it to the man because I remember thinking that calling it a scorpion elixir compared to snake oil didn't make it sound much better. "No, it doesn't," I said and smiled a thin smile. He had hundreds of little bottles of this stuff. It was odd looking. It was a clear green liquid. The little bottles were clear and had funny markings on them. He sold them for a nickel each. "Those fellas are everywhere," I told her, speaking from experience. "It ain't all that odd to have a few of them show up. One might argue it would be odd if none had shown up." "Maybe," she said, looking off into the distance, as was her way. "But most people drank the stuff. Pretty much right after they did is when things in Empire started getting out of hand. They dug up that building they call a church right after." That last part sounded odd. "You mean they built the building?" She stopped and looked at me hard. "That is odd, isn't it? They dug it up. It was under the hill. Freemasonry and all that." Our plan was terrible, but it was the best we could figure, given we knew we had to change up our approach from what the Texas boys knew, as it certainly meant AB knew it now too. I was dealing with Betty's specific worldviews as well. She didn't care about anything except getting revenge. To confound the matter, she wasn't very helpful in figuring out a new approach. She would repeat the strategy framework to me several more times, but saying it repeatedly didn't provide a new plan. I also realized that she would simply agree with anything I proposed. I couldn't bounce ideas off her like I used to do with AB, so I landed on the best approach possible given our conflicting goals. I suppose she did help in some ways, since she wouldn't listen to ideas until I could explain what we were trying to accomplish. So, what were we trying to do? It took me a while, but the answer was both simple and unpleasant. We wanted to kill as many devil worshippers as we could, as a way of avenging her father. Well, I'm using the royal we here. While I had found my resolve waning, the more I thought about confronting AB Betty, on the other hand, couldn't see past getting revenge. The distinct impression I was getting was that she was working on just one side of the plan. I'm pretty sure she wasn't concerned about getting out alive. Did I really care that a bunch of red-headed freaks were having orgies and murdering each other up in Empire? Couldn't even get to the town without crossing the gorge on the Oh My God road. It wasn't like many folks would accidentally wander up there and start having problems. They are located relatively specifically, if you get my meaning. I'm having a terrible time. I can't get out of my own head. Apparently, with AB still alive, my resolve to go straight was getting cold feet. Now, on top of that, I'm starting to feel guilty for helping Betty get herself killed. "We need to stop," I said. We were still on the main trail. There wasn't anyone else around in any direction. We were on a gently rolling plot of land in a bit of a valley. The wind was blowing stronger. It was turning into a pleasant day. The weather didn't look like it would turn. She stopped and looked at me. "I don't think our plan is going to work," I said, trying to make eye contact, but she would look around a lot to avoid it. "If I can get close to the mayor, I can shoot him," she said, as though she were re-explaining our plan to me, like I was a child who had forgotten it. "You said all 4 of them were corrupted, right?" She crinkled her nose. "Corrupted?" "Yeah," I said. No other word came to mind, so I stumbled some. "You know, scary looking, like the Lord Byron story." The Lord Byron reference was from his epic poem called the Giaour. While mostly romance, which is probably why Betty was allowed to read it, the story does go off the rails a few times, and it does even dip into vampire land. It used to just be the preacher who looked like that, but the last time I saw them all when they did what they did to my pa, she looked down to the ground. Yes, all 4 of them got it now. They all look different from before, except for the preacher, who already looked different. Does that make sense? None of this makes any sense, I snapped at her, immediately regretted it, then softened my voice considerably. Sorry, I don't mean you. I mean the situation. I watched her face change. She almost cracked, then pulled herself together. She wasn't as stoic as I thought. I was doing the opposite of underestimating her. I was assuming that she didn't have feelings. She was opening and closing her mouth. "You okay?" I asked. She kind of folded down in one motion and sat down cross-legged on the ground. "I miss my pa," she said. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Natural to feel grief," I said. "Means you're normal, not the other way around. Were you sad when you thought AB was dead?" I hadn't addressed my feelings since Idaho Springs a month gone. Let's see what they're telling me. "I miss him, sure, but I think it was more relief than sadness." She looked up at me. Her eyes were puffy red. She had snot coming out of her nose. "Mister," she said very sincerely, "you don't seem to understand. I've got to manage myself more than other folks. I've heard you mention that a couple times now, sure. I ain't just saying it. I'm a handful. Pa was working on setting me up to be able to live on my own. He knew he wasn't going to be around forever, but we weren't close yet. He expired considerably earlier than the plan called for. Betty," I was being earnest and sincere, "I'll help you get settled. We can find a place, a nice town on the plain." She cut me off. "Hold on there, mister. Are you proposing? I ain't the marrying type. I just need help getting the people that got my pa." "What?" I probably reacted too vigorously, as it looked like her feelings were hurt. Before I could say anything else, she responded. "Well, I appreciate it and all, mister, but I ain't the marrying type," she repeated. "Also, I need to point out that your timing is terrible, me grieving for my pa and all." I sat down next to her, so we were both looking in the same direction. I asked her, "What do you reckon is standing between you and a situation where you can live somewhere nice and manage everything?" I tried to say it as nicely as I could. She made that series of faces again that seemed to be how she worked through sad emotions. She shook her head no. "I've been thinking on that this whole time." I waited. She took a very long pause. "I don't think I can do it without Pa." I waited some more, but she was done. I couldn't think of a way forward, but I knew there was one. I just needed more time to think. "Betty," I said, "we're not that far from where we camped last night. It was a good spot. Let's go back up there, get some more rest, and think harder about what needs doing. One day this way or that ain't going to change anything in Empire." I didn't know if a day would make a difference or not. Still, my brain was apparently trying to get me to consider alternate approaches. Hence, both me and it were in agreement on this one. I noticed tears running down her face again. "I got to avenge my pa," she said. "We will, but the two of us ain't going to just walk in there and get very far. We need more time to think." "I told you," she said sternly. "If I can get close to them, I'll shoot them. You don't have to do much, just back me up." "Betty, I got the plan. It's not that I don't know it. It's that I think it's a one-way trip if we do it that way." She got forcibly upset, something I had never seen. "Mister, I don't know how to be any clearer with you. I don't want to come away from it. I just gotta know it's done." I shook my head. She was basically saying that she wanted to commit suicide by Empire, but only after she got revenge on those who wronged her. Look, I know I keep saying that's not a great plan, but the truth is that AB and I had many dust-ups where we didn't even have a strategy this good, much less a plan better than what Betty was proposing. I decided to use psychology. "I got it. I just need more time to think. I promise we'll figure it out and you'll get what you need. But can we just rest up and think more? That's all I ask. It's a reasonable request, right? One more day to see if there is a better way to avenge your pa. I met the man. He wouldn't want you to go off and do the wrong thing when you could have figured out the right thing if you had just tried harder." "Mister, no one tries as hard as I do," she said quickly when I had finished. The psychology had worked. I suppressed a smile so as not to spook her. "Good," I said as though I was the school marm rewarding my best student. "What's so good about that?" "Well," I said in a scholarly way, "if no one tries harder than you, then we don't have a choice but to go back to camp and work through all the details. That's the hard work, and no one works harder than you, right?" I had twisted the statement just a little, but I could see by her expression that it had worked. She couldn't disagree and still see herself as she did. "What else we got to figure out? Attack vectors, contingency plans, what to do if this or that happens, so we're on the same page," I said, just coming up with anything I could think of that sounded official. I started to stand up, her head twisted sharply to the side when I did. She looked over at me. "Mister, this better not be some play for my affection. I already told you I ain't the marrying type." I nodded, now fully into my new strategy for dealing with her. "I heard you, Betty. I can't say I am not disappointed, but I filed away your current position on the matter. I won't be going against your wishes." She held eye contact with me as she stood up, her eyes squinted some as she watched me suspiciously. "You are an odd duck, mister," she said, still eyeing me up. You don't know the half of it, I said, as we fell into step with each other, heading back the way we had come. Chapter 12, Cold Camp Round 2. I was still flummoxed. A month ago, everything had made perfect sense, and no one knew my name. AB and I were up raising hell in Wyoming. I knew my place in the world, and had a pretty good time hanging out in that place. Sure, there were dangers and perils, but that was part of the fun. I honestly never thought more than maybe 10 minutes ahead. Everything I did was in the moment. Now, that old me seemed very foreign, and not just because I was going it alone. AB had specifically staged his death to get away from me. He was the only person I trusted, and now in hindsight, he may have been the one person I should have been suspicious of. So before, everything made sense, and no one knew my name. Now, everyone seemed to know my name, and nothing made much sense. Betty and I didn't talk on the way back. She was being odd, even for her. She kept looking back over her shoulder, but I had no idea what it was she was expecting to see back there. Weren't no one around out here. When we returned to our spot, I realized she was pouting. She went to her sleeping area and sat down in a huff. I hadn't been around children much since I left civilization, but my instincts were that she was susceptible to childlike tantrums, which I very much wanted to avoid, given her physical strength. "Betty?" I finally asked. "What?" She responded softly, but with indignation. "We got the rest of the day. Tell me what you and your pa were working on, and I'll see if I can help. My assessment of the situation is that you are more than capable and certainly stronger than I am." She snorted. "Your assessment of the situation? Mister, what do you know about my situation? I can't be no clearer, yet you ain't lifted one single finger to assess nothing, much less help move things in the right direction. Because I want to think through everything before you go commit suicide by Empire Devil worshippers." Dagnabit, I heard myself say it. Shoot, I had been in reasonable control until now. I needed to handle her with kid gloves. There was a long silence. I watched her process. Finally, she said, "Well, mister, when you put it like that, I guess you ain't being all that unreasonable." I had to stop underestimating her and just simply treat her like I would any fella. "I think it won't always go well, but it'll be more hits than misses." I decided to go back to my psychology strategy. "Want to know what I think?" I asked her. "You've been blathering on now for the better part of the morning. You mean you ain't managed to get across what you think yet?" "I've been reckoning on things. You want to hear it or not?" I spat back. I was still playing the role. I wasn't actually mad, but it seemed she was better at reading emotions than picking up on other non-verbal cues. "Get it off your chest so we can stop talking about it," I smiled. "I think you and your pa already worked everything out. I think he taught you what you needed to know already." Betty started to protest, but I talked over her. "Hear me out. I think you pretend some so people underestimate you. I think you pretended with your pa too because you were afraid he would leave you once he thought you were ready." She opened her mouth and closed it a couple times. I wasn't trying to be mean to her. I stayed quiet so she could think. I had to imagine that she didn't get into too many challenging conversations, so this was unexplored territory for her. After a few more moments of silence, her face changed. All at once, she started bawling. A deep, meaningful cry that shook every inch of her frame. It got awkward for me. I wouldn't do nothing except sit here and wait if she were a fella, so I followed that approach. I couldn't visualize me getting up, and what? Pat her on the back and say they're there? She settled into a rhythm and cried for a while, maybe half an hour. Finally, it felt like it was okay to talk. "First time allowing it all to sink in?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, half laughing from under the steady sobs. "What was your pa's name?" I asked. "Wilbur," she said between breaths. "Good strong name," I said. She laughed again, which immediately caused her to cough. "Is," she said after the fit. She even smiled after she said it like the thought was comforting. "Where do you two hail from?" She steadied herself. When she spoke again, her voice was much calmer. "We lived in South Carolina when I was little. Pa was one of our town councilmen. When the war started, our little town, along with the county, voted to succeed back to the Union, to join North Carolina even though we weren't rightly connected in a direct way. We were a good number of miles on the South Carolina side of things. So, word gets out about the vote, and pretty quick, We're overrun with rebs. This was at the beginning of things when everyone was enthusiastic, but Pa was a smart one. He got my brother and me out just before they arrived, and we worked our way here to Colorado. It was a harrowing journey through the beginnings of the war. I picked up on the brother comment and felt hope. You got yourself a brother out here? What? She seemed surprised by the question. Oh, right. No, sorry. He got drafted somewhere around Texas. Drafted? Sure, she said. He fought in the Battle of Galveston. I understood. So he died in the Battle of Galveston, I take it? She snorted. Yes, her voice was very small. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, unsure what else to say. Now you got me all doubly sad, mister, she said. It must have been true as her sobbing intensified again. It's normal to miss people you loved when they're gone, I said. I decided to push things forward a little, trying to learn from all the other times I misread her and used kid gloves when I shouldn't have. Her face crinkled. She squeezed her eyes closed. When I'm sad, I'm really sad. More than most. When I'm happy, it's not nearly as strong. But sadness and anger, I feel those more than most. A light went off. I knew what she was talking about. We learned about it in the psychology classes I took at college back east. This was called circular insanity. No, wait, they recently changed what they called it. What was it now? Right, bipolar disorder. I started to tell her I knew what was wrong, but found I didn't speak. My brain waited until I gave the okay. I'm showing progress. After composing my thoughts, I said, Betty, I know what you've got. It's called bipolar disorder. You're not weird. About 1 out of every 100 people have some form of it. I even know the treatment. I wanted to give her hope. She looked up at me through her blood-red eyes. She was a mess. How could you know all that? We studied it in school. I got a college education. Heck, I even went to West Point. Do you know what West Point is? She looked hopeful. Sure, Army school. But what's West Point got to do with me? I laughed a friendly laugh. Nothing, Betty. Every time I think about my college time back east in civilization, it leads directly to my Army time, that's all. Anyway, for this bipolar thing, when you feel it, you are supposed to go to sleep for a while. I actually knew that there was a drug they used that made you fall asleep. I didn't know what it was explicitly called. It was just a general form of sedation. The theory was that people with this disorder are more susceptible to it when tired or unrested, and instead of becoming dangerous when experiencing significant emotional swings, simply going to sleep protected them from themselves. She laughed. That sounds impossible, mister. These feelings tend to keep me awake, not put me to sleep. Oh, okay. I wasn't a doctor by any stretch. I was sure about what I remembered, though. So the drug they gave to put them to sleep must be the key. Maybe it's not as simple as I had understood it to be. I looked at her for a long while as I thought. She picked up on my thinking, and her expression slowly changed from indifference to curiosity. I started to get the feeling that few people she had run into that said they were there to help actually provided any help. She slowly seemed to realize that I was actually trying to be helpful. After a while longer, Betty put her finger to her nose and pushed in one side, then blew hard. A steady stream of gunk flew out. Then she did the other side and pushed herself up to stand. I appreciate you thinking on it, mister, but I've been round this wagon enough times to know what's on the other side of it. She looked me in the eye hard, then continued. Ain't nothing on the other side that's different from the side we're standing on. Her face hardened. Got it! I don't need to be filled with empty promises by some fella who flunked out of doctor school. I graduated, Betty, but it wasn't medical school. It was just a regular old college school. Don't change anything, she said, still looking at me hard. I started to believe she was waiting for me to say something else about it, like I needed to work to convince her. It changes everything. It means all we need to do is figure out what medicine they're using and then get you some of it. You'll be right as rain. Then the next part I just heard as I said it. It wouldn't have been all that different had I given it some thought. We can go find a small town somewhere that ain't got a barber yet. I'll front the business and you do the cuts and shaves. If you get tired, you take some medicine and start up again when you feel better. Ain't like no one gonna complain, right? Where else they going to go if we pick the right town? This felt good, like being back with AB. Don't get me wrong, Betty wasn't a business partner like AB was, but in all fairness, AB couldn't cut hair like Betty could. They both brought something unique to the table. This was the ticket. I did want to go straight, but straight didn't mean I had to completely jump ship and work for the other side as a sheriff. Going straight could mean starting a legitimate business somewhere, leaving all the legal enforcements to the young and the restless. For the first time in my life, I realized there were more legitimate pursuits than just sheriffing. Betty still looked concerned, but I felt great. This was the answer, and it helped both of us. Plus, it kept her alive. If left to her own devices, she's working hard to get killed. Shoot, I bet we could recruit more of these big, strong, single-of-focus Betty types and open a barbershop in a bunch of small towns. I could become the barber king, overseeing hundreds of barbers across the West. Be downright bad manners to get your hair cut or face shaved somewhere else. Betty asked, "You sure cheered up in a hurry there, mister." I realized that I was again lost in my own head. I must have allowed my silly dreams to show on my face. I was a good mite farther down this road than she was, so I knew I had to back up and be a salesman. What do you think? We could at least try it. The Empire Devil Worshippers will be there for the killing, even if we do it tomorrow or in a month of tomorrows. If we try what? She said, confused. We see if we can head back east a bit, maybe just to Denver City. I know some folks there. We find a doctor and see if we can get the relaxation medicine. Then you try it and see if it works. Can we do that after I settle the score for my pa in Empire? She asked. She clearly wasn't connecting the dots I was trying to communicate to her. I tried more psychology. What would your pa want for you? Would he want you to get yourself killed seeking revenge, or to get set up in Denver City with some medicine to help you live a good life? This was a bit of a cheat on my part. AB had taught me this trick. I could see her face go into her processing configuration, so cheat or not, it looked like it was working. After a bit, she said he wouldn't want me inciting no violence. It felt like she was trying to rationalize in her head. Probably didn't touch too often on the subject of her pa being bitten in the neck and bleeding out where she was contemplating revenge for the act and would certainly die in the effort. Not your daily conversational material, I suspected. We had talked most of the day away. It's getting on, I said. Why don't you go set up your rabbit traps again? If we can catch something before nightfall, I bet we could get it cooked around sunset with fire and little risk. Too dark to see the smoke, too light to see the flames. Chapter 13, Bad to Worse. She did catch a couple rabbits. We each had a whole one to ourselves. We got them cooked as night fell. I had let the embers burn low so we could see better, but I didn't let them get so bright that they were visible from more than a few feet away. We ate with little conversation and turned in early. We'd be up at dawn and then start our walk back to Denver City. I slept like a baby. I had a few dreams. They were all very pleasant. At one point in the dream, I was covered in a pile of bunnies and kittens, all warm and soft. I felt fantastic and slept the best sleep of my life. Mentally, it had simply never occurred to me that there were all these options and things to do on the law-abiding side of the road. I'm being serious. As an outlaw, it's a pretty simple life. Find an opportunity and take stuff. Just those acts created enough activity that something was always going on. Remind me at some point. I need to explain how I went from being a 12-year-old runaway to a college graduate who got into West Point. I don't have time now. Things are about to take a turn, and we got to get to it all. But the other is a fun story as well, so I'm sure you'll want to hear it at some point. Anyway, back to my more immediate musings. I had never paid attention to how many different things there were to do. What a great country. I could do anything I wanted. If I wanted to run a barbershop empire full of Bettys, there was nothing to stop me. And what a good person I was being. Taking Betty back to Denver to find the medicine that I knew about from my studies at college, that darn education finally paid off. I couldn't believe it. I just felt great. That's not even the right word. I didn't know the word for it. I was confident that I knew who I wanted to be and that I had the plan to get there. I was going to be on the right side of the law, I bet even a pillar in the community. Don't have to be a sheriff or watch out for any lawmen. Lest they want a haircut, I smiled to myself as I opened my eyes from my slumber. Life was heading to Easy Street. I had finally figured it all out. I looked around. Betty's spot was empty. It looked like maybe she had gotten up before the first light, probably out checking the rabbit traps. Boy, if it worked out that we each got another whole one for breakfast, I might have to take out the waist on my pants. Could start putting some of the weight I've lost over the past month or so back on. I stood up and stretched. It was brisk this morning, cold but no wind, so it was tolerable. I was in such a good mood I didn't care. Nature required a few necessary morning activities. Betty still wasn't back. I remade the fire and let it flame higher than I usually would. We were celebrating, after all. What did we have to worry about? We're just a couple of businessmen, barbers. Business barbers? Don't know. I could ponder it on the walk back. It would probably take 2 or 3 days to make it east out of the mountains and to Denver City. We could also head south and west and land in Georgetown. It wasn't as big a place as Denver City, but it was a full day closer. Would Georgetown have a drugstore? I knew Denver City did. It was a conundrum. Do we risk that Georgetown had a drugstore and save a day, or do we push to Denver, where I know there are several, but we'll be on the trail a mite longer? I don't think AB or any of the Empire mess would involve them sending out people to try and harass us. I can't imagine they even remembered that we exist. Sure, AB will have been told I was run out of town. I don't think that will prompt him to do anything different. Eventually, they'll start to wonder where the Texas man is. His partner will finally head out to look for him, but we are talking about a week at the soonest. Betty and I will be far into the wind no matter which direction we head. We'll have made as clean a getaway as we could have hoped for. I looked around. Still no sign of Betty. Where could she have gone? I looked at the fire. It was starting to flame down, which meant it would be prime for cooking in a few minutes. I debated the wisdom of leaving the fire unattended. I looked around. Things were plenty damp and relatively snow-covered. It'd be fine. I'm not going to start calling out, though. While I didn't get the sense that someone was lurking about, and I had a refined skill for that type of thing, I wasn't going to play the fool just yet. I headed down the path to where she had set up the rabbit traps. They were simple, practical contraptions. She found long, flat rocks, propped them up precariously with a stick, and put a little piece of vegetation under the rock. Usually within a day, a rabbit hopped in, disturbed the stick, and bam, an ingredient for stew. It was better than a snare. Her father had taught her well. With the snare, the rabbit sometimes started screaming. This way was much better, and since the stone crushed them, one less thing to have to handle later. I found the spots where she had set the traps. They were all sprung, but no rabbits. Did I miss her? Maybe she walked back to our little camp another way? I looked around, trying to pick up a sense of anything, but there was nothing there. I was starting to feel alone in the mountain forest. When I got back to the camp, nothing had changed. The fire was acting normally, as was the dirt and stacks of branches we each used to make our lean-tos. I had the perfect fire, but nothing to cook. I didn't even have a pot to make coffee. Not that I had any coffee, so it was odd that I would think first about the pot. Oh well, I knew what was going on. My brain was flooding me with information to try and keep me from the revelation that Betty had gotten up before me and left. Shoot, I risked one call out. Betty! I yelled as loud as I could. I listened. Nothing. AB was the tracker, not me. I could read basic signs, but I wasn't anywhere close to being able to discern signs around our camp and down the path we took as to which footprints were from yesterday and which ones were from today. Plus, since I had just walked a good run of the trail leading out of camp, I had just walked over the best prints. I looked over to the base of the tree where I had put my stuff. The rifle was there, but the extra ammo was gone. On instinct, my right hand slid down and confirmed the hunting knife was still in its sheath on my hip. It was. I picked the rifle up and checked the load. It was a breech loader with a spring and room for 5 rounds. It was loaded, but with only 5 rounds, I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. My brain knew what was going on, but I was fighting to let it fill me in. I knew what the answer would be, and I knew what it would mean, but I wanted to avoid the answer like the plague. "Okay, brain," I said to myself softly under my breath. "Let's hear it." I put down my guard, and sure enough, my brain filled me in on what I already knew. Betty had gone back to Empire, and she was going to commit suicide by devil worshippers. How long ago had she left? I'd been awake now for probably 20 minutes, maybe a bit more. It was still fairly early in morning. She couldn't have left much more than an hour ago. We were about 4 hours away, at a brisk walk to Empire. Come on, Rick. Stupid brain. I would have to run for maybe 2 hours or so to catch her. If I did, I could get to her well outside of Empire. I wasn't in any kind of shape to start running for hours at a time. A large part of me didn't want to do it. The exertion would be extreme. For all I knew, Betty would just wander off again at her next opportunity. I went round and round with myself for longer than I should have. Then I had the thought, maybe this was the test, the universe, God, or whoever, putting a real obstacle in my way, probing to see if I was really worthy of the new life I desired. Almost immediately after that thought, I also realized that if I tried to do the right thing but for the wrong reasons, I would probably fail the test that way too. What a mess, and all my own doing, and firmly because of choices I'd made. Was I responsible for Betty's father being killed? Would it make a difference if it was my fault versus a simple act of fate? I know that you know, and you're getting tired of me not seeing it, or at the very least, yapping on about it instead of just doing it. I guess it's a psychological thing. Don't project too much energy at me. You'd probably have had just as hard a time as I was having in this career change. I know. Betty's getting farther away every minute I wait. Dagnabit. Okay, I'll go. I'm only doing it because I don't want you to think less of me. God, I hated civilization. Life is so much easier when you stay on the edges of things and just kind of ride the wind wherever it blows. That seemed to be the big difference. To go straight, I need to constantly be paying attention, sizing things up, and thinking about what's right and what's wrong. I liked my life just a month ago better. Didn't have to rely on nothing. No planning, no real concept of other people other than marks and gimps, who of course made the best marks. Nuts. I just looked up. I've been jogging for a couple minutes. My damn brain took over and got the show moving a while ago. Sure, it can make decisions with no consequences. Now I was the one who had to run the whole frigging way. Chapter 14, Empire. Heck has come calling. Of course, it was high noon when I got to the ridge north of Empire. I was drenched in sweat and had a good-sized blister on my right heel that caused me to walk with a limp. I carried the rifle in my right hand and had shed my outer jacket on the run. I'd have to go back and get it at some point, or else I'll be too cold to sleep once the weather turns. I had my hat tilted all the way back. I ran my arm across my forehead for the millionth time to keep the sweat out of my eyes. Betty was standing in the middle of the road. She was yelling something at a bunch of the townsfolk. The whole gaggle was standing in the middle of the street in the middle of town. It looked like Mayor O'Brien and the preacherman were taking the brunt of her verbal chidings. The first thing I did was scan the area for the O'Brien boys. Didn't see them anywhere. Then I focused on the mayor and preacher. The other 6 or 7 people stood back. They all looked like gypsies. I cannot for the life of me figure this town out or seem to get a straight story. Now I'm a law-abiding citizen, but my stories are all curlicues. Used to be the other way around. The rifle didn't have a scope. I had good eyesight, better than most, but not good enough to study the gypsies from up here on the ridge. They were maybe 300 feet away. The mayor and preacher started to step towards Betty. I could see plain as day what was about to happen. She wasn't drawing her sidearm. She didn't understand the danger she was in. No, she understood. She really was going to force them to kill her. Nuts. I started sprinting along the ridge. I couldn't run straight at them. The slope was too severe. I tried my best to keep my eye on the goings-on. The preacher had moved behind Betty. He was moments from leaping onto her and biting her neck. I fired the rifle into the air, completely out of other ideas. I would never make the distance in time. The noise of the reports startled everyone, even Betty. I screamed, "Leave her be!" as loud as I could, then started firing the rifle into the crowd. I wasn't hitting anything. The rounds bounced off the ground yards away from anyone. This was a lousy rifle, and yes, I knew I was a terrible shot. I am going to have to dedicate some time to marksmanship training. Without AB around, being good with a hunting knife no longer seemed very handy, given how many people I was constantly dealing with. The group of gypsies suddenly moved quite quickly, all in unison. They moved between Betty and me, protecting the mayor and the preacher, who pounced on Betty and knocked her cold. They then started carrying her back to the Devil Church building. Betty had said they dug the building out of the dirt. I had seen a couple buildings where they told me the same thing, but I never believed them. Who would build this massive, weird-looking building and then bury it, only to dig it back up and use it? Way too much work. The preacher and mayor moved much quicker than I would have thought possible. Betty was no light load, but they carried her like a small child. They were exhibiting strength beyond what I believed to be anything close to normal. The rifle clicked empty, so I dropped it and drew the hunting knife. The 6 gypsies were standing in a row, crouched down, waiting for me to expend the energy to close the distance between us. As I got close enough to see them clearly, I realized they didn't look right at all. Their eyes were kind of a milky white, covering the pupil, which I could see moving from side to side underneath the membrane. Their skin was king of a green-yellow, and I swear on AB's grave, yes, I know, that I caught glimpses of filed-down teeth behind their lips. My brain started telling me that these were monsters, not people. It assured me that using the hunting knife to end them was righteous and for the good of humanity. My brain and I agreed. I slipped back into old Rick mode. When I got within about 20 yards of the gypsies, they broke into a sprint right at me. My lord, they were fast, and I was winded to near exhaustion. They came at me in a line. I shifted to my right. They would end up surrounding me, but if I could get to one end of the line, the ones on the other side would have to contend with each other to get to me. Each had their hands extended to their sides, which made the running look awkward. Then I noticed that their fingernails were very long and filed into points just like their teeth were. My God, they were drooling as they ran, a primal reaction to the expectation of eating me. I put the hunting knife in my right hand and turned the blade so it extended down my arm as I held it in a fist. I should have angled to the left side, not the right, a mistake I needed to correct somehow. I only had a second to think. When the farthest monster to the right reached out for me, I ducked down and went to its left side, running the blade across its stomach with my right hand. It was a smart move, and I got lucky. The next monster swung its clawed hand over my head since I had ducked down to deal with the first one. The first one, whose stomach and bowels I had just opened up, who was currently spilling out all over the bleached yellow dirt that made up the main road through town. This patch here sure has seen a lot of blood over the past month. We were standing about where the whore had been beaten and bled out last time I was here. I was in the moment, though. If I was good at anything, it was killing other men with a hunting knife. I spun and sliced through the gypsy's arm that had missed me. I ran the blade up under the arm and into its pit, pushing into its heart. It worked. He went lights out in about 3 seconds. The other 4 had overrun my position, stopped, and turned for another attack. I wish I had a handgun. Even I could have hit them from this close range, but I didn't. I could feel my heart thumping a mile a minute. I was gasping for air and sweating profusely. My brain jumped in to help. Good old brain. It flooded my system with adrenaline, which hit me in a forceful wave. I knew it wouldn't last, so I sprinted forward, taking the initiative away from the 4 remaining monsters. I took a gamble and made the exact same move again. It had worked better than it should have the first time. I sprinted forward, angling to my right again. Then at the last minute, I went low and to the left of the farthest gypsy. I got the same result. I was able to gut one, then spun and countered the second attack, taking the monster out just like before. The other 2 overran me again, but not by as much. They were adapting, but I had already been as lucky as I needed to be. Taking on 6 men with a hunting knife was terrible odds, but honestly, me against now just 2, it wasn't going to be a problem. Instead of running, I assumed a fighting stance. The last 2 monsters came at me together in a coordinated attack. I saw the swings of their arms from a mile off, and I quickly dispensed with them both. Once it was all over, I looked around, on full alert. I waited for a while, but nothing happened. Wherever everyone else was, it wasn't here. Was the whole rest of the town up in the Devil Building? I looked around. The place was deserted. I found myself walking back down the road to the little general store. I looked in the windows, but no one was about. The front door was locked, a cheap metal sliding bolt. I kicked the door in and went inside, heading straight for the boxed handguns under the register. I unboxed 2 Colt sidearms and found a box of cartridges for them. These had a little cupped slip to load each cartridge into the revolver instead of having to unseat the round chamber, load it, and reseat it. I hated this configuration, but it wasn't like I'd be doing a lot of reloading today, so I pushed my frustrations away. It always came down to this. Everything started with great intrigue and ended up with me chasing devil worshippers around with my hunting knife and now sidearms, trying to save Crazy Betty from being eaten alive. Seriously, no matter which side of the law I'm on, this is how it always ended up. I found an apron and wiped my face and neck off. I was still drenched in sweat. I looked around. There was some chocolate in a clear glass container. I didn't much care for the stuff, but I knew it was full of sugar, which meant energy, so I forced myself to eat a decent amount of it, probably a couple dollars worth of the stuff. Almost from the first bite, I could feel my body using the sugar. It made me feel a lot better. I wiped my face off a second time, then found a belt where I could holster the 2 sidearms. I put a fistful of the rounds from the open box in my pocket, wiped off my hunting knife, and headed out the door to the Devil Building. Chapter 15. The Devil Building. About halfway to the building, I saw the footprints change. They were dragging Betty now instead of carrying her. The drag marks went right up and into the place's front door, which was left wide open. I approached carefully, standing to the side of the door so as not to silhouette myself as I approached. Not that I felt like the mayor or preacher would shoot me. I felt they wanted to eat me. But still, no reason to be more stupid than I'm already being, trying to help Betty and all. When I got to the open door, I could smell that awful oil smell wafting out. The interior was pitch black. It was either go in here or go in through the office in the back. Screw it. I crouched and rolled diagonally from the left side of the outside of the door to the right side of the door, inside the building. I waited for my eyes to adjust. The place was very dark. As I waited, I nearly gagged on the oil smell. It was stronger here, even than when they were rubbing it all over me when I was up on the pole. I heard low chanting from way down in the front. The inside wasn't all that extraordinary. I expected flames and all kinds of evil iconography. It just kind of looked like a run-of-the-mill church. There were rows of pews facing where the preacherman would have stood. They had an upside-down cross on the back wall. Really one of the only clues, other than the smell, that this wasn't your typical Bible-thumping church. Then, I saw what was going on. What the hell was wrong with these people? They had Betty stripped naked and tied up just like I had been, hands above her head, hoisted up and held by a rope. I had seen nearly everything, but I had never seen anything like this. Betty was bleeding from her neck. A lot of blood, almost certainly a bite wound. She had a large frame. No wonder she was so strong. I tried not to remember too much out of modesty for her. But honestly, that first image of her up there on the stage, tied up naked, the upside-down cross behind her, and all the blood. I doubt I'll ever be able to unsee it. I drew the pistols and started to run forward. My brain started screaming to stop. What the hell, brain? Send me adrenaline if you want to help, but don't tie me up now with a dialogue, I thought. Rick, my brain said, we need to figure out what's going on. If you just run up there and shoot the mayor and preacher, we can't ask them questions. Who cares, brain? Betty is bleeding out, and these 2 are cannibals. But what if we can save them? Some kind of antidote for the elixir. It rang true. I did want to know what was going on, but in the end, I rejected the idea. I felt a responsibility to Betty that I had not felt since working with AB. I heard gunshots, very loud and very close. I realized it was me. I was firing at the 2 men I knew to be the mayor and preacher. Bam! Pause. Bam! Pause. Bam! Pause. I was slowly firing one gun and then the other. I had one aimed at one of the men, one at the other. Every shot was hitting. At first, I was shooting them in the back. Then they turned and tried to make their way to me, so I emptied the rest of the rounds into their front. I aimed for their faces with the last couple of shots, as the body hits didn't seem to be doing anything. By the time I was just a few feet away, I had 2 bullets in both men's backs, 2 in their chests, and 2 nearly point blank into their faces. They both fell, unrecognizable. I would swear it was only the last couple of shots that had any real impact. I dropped the Colts and tried to lift Betty up to unhook her hands from the little ring they were tied to up on the post. She was covered in the rancid oil. It was nearly impossible, given her size and the oil, but I finally managed to do it. She fell to the floor harder than I should have let her, but at least she was down. The impact woke her up. "Jesus Christ, mister, where are my clothes?" I looked around and didn't see them anywhere. I stepped over to where the preacherman kept his preaching robe on a wooden knob near the back wall. I took the robe off the wall and handed it to Betty. "Whose blood is all this?" she said, taking the robe from me and putting it on when she stood up. "It's yours," I said. "Does your neck hurt?" "Heck yeah, it hurts," she said, putting her hand up to it and understanding. "Am I going to bleed out?" I had already decided she wasn't going to. They had bit her neck, but more to the back. The main artery that runs down the side was intact. Clearly, the cannibals knew what they were doing. They wanted her alive for whatever this ritual was that I had interrupted. "I don't think you will bleed out, but we need to be careful, and I need to sew the wound closed," I said. "I got some needle and thread back in the barber shop," she said. "Is it safe to go back there?" I thought some. My brain was quiet, so I had to do all the work. I honestly didn't think there was anyone left in the town. It felt empty now. I had no idea where everyone went. I really didn't have a clue as to what was going on anymore. "Let me help you walk," I said, leaning into her and putting one arm around her waist. "It doesn't matter if there is anyone left." "I don't think there is," I said, as we slowly walked in tandem. "I reckon you running a needle through my neck wound is gonna hurt something fierce," she said. "Oh yeah," I said. No point in telling her anything but the truth. "Do you have any idea why the town is now abandoned? Do you know where Killian is? He could help us. He's the good guy in all of this," she said. "You keep telling me that," I said. She stopped and pushed me away so she could make eye contact with me. "Seems I lived," she said, staring intently at me and holding eye contact. The opposite of how she usually dealt with me. "Looks that way, although we need to get you to a real doctor. That's a horrible wound, and we're going to have to worry about an infection in a couple days." She put her arm up, indicating she wanted me to help her start walking again. "You saw me naked, didn't you?" she asked me after a while. "Seems so," I said. "Mister, I already told you I ain't interested." "Yeah, I got that straight away, Betty. No worries." "Okay, good. I know it's going to be hard for you now, not getting all romantic about me, fighting off your primal urges. Seeing someone naked is what's supposed to happen after the marriage ceremony, not before." That got me thinking. "Betty, I think you're onto something. I think they were trying to hitch you to the devil or something. Same as me. They were trying to complete a devil ceremony, and we've now stopped them twice in a row." She stopped again and looked me in the eye. "Mister, you gotta promise me we'll see this through. I didn't want to be around no more, but I have a new lease on life. You gotta promise we will go find Killian, find that man who sold the snake oil and poisoned the town, figure out why these buried buildings are all over the place." I already knew this. Betty and I were pretty much the same in how we thought about the world. "You gotta promise too, Betty. We gotta do the things you suggested, but we gotta find AB too. We have to figure out what's going on. Deal with that other Texas Ranger. Put all the pieces together." "Sure," she nodded and fell into step again with me helping her. We were outside now. The day was bright and it hurt my eyes as they adjusted from the dark devil building. "That's good balance, mister. Some things I got to do, some things you got to do, and we'll help each other." I nodded. I kept looking around for anyone, for any signs of trouble. The little town of Empire was empty. There was blood on the street, but the 6 bodies I had dispatched earlier were gone, only the blood on the ground as a testament they had ever existed. We spent a couple hours in the barber shop. I sewed her wound closed. She just sat there and took it. I don't think I could have, not without a lot of whiskey first. But Betty didn't drink, or at least didn't want to right now. Who knows what went on in her head? We left under cover of darkness. I planned on hiding out in the woods until she healed up. It would take a while, at least a couple weeks. We could talk through what happened and put a plan together. This was just the beginning of the story. Things proceeded to fall off the rails almost immediately after she was fully recovered. I'll tell you that story next. First, though, I've got to find a real drink. The end.